There is a stretch of coastline on the western edge of Scotland where the Atlantic comes in, hard and cold off the open ocean, where the cliffs are so old they predate almost every other rock formation in the British Isles, and where the people who live there still carry, inside their blood, something that geneticists cannot fully explain, something that the rest of Europe lost or never had, something that has been circulating in those same families, generation after generation, for longer than the Roman Empire existed, longer than the pyramids of Giza have been standing, and for most of human history, nobody knew it was there at all. This is not a story about myth. It is not a story about tartan and bagpipes and Braveheart and the romantic version of Scotland that gets sold in airport gift shops. It is a story about genetics, about ancient populations, about a chain of survival that stretches back further than you probably imagined possible, and about why the Scottish people, particularly those in the Highlands and the Western Isles, carry genetic signatures that exist nowhere else in Europe in quite the same configuration, and what those signatures might tell us about who was really here before the world we know began. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check those comments every single time, and there is something quietly extraordinary about seeing someone in Cape Town reading this at sunrise, while someone in Vancouver is watching it at 2 in the morning, and someone in Edinburgh is listening to it on a Tuesday afternoon, all of us connected by the same thread of curiosity about who we really are and where we really came from. That thread runs a long way back. Tonight we follow it. The island of Lewis sits in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwestern coast of Scotland. It is not a small island. It covers nearly 900 square miles of peat bog, loch, and moorland, and it is battered year-round by weather systems coming unimpeded off 3,000 miles of open Atlantic. There are no large trees on Lewis. The soil is too thin, and the wind too constant for them to take hold in most places. There are standing stones that have been there since before Egypt built its first dynasty. Enormous prehistoric megaliths, arranged in patterns that still provoke debate about their astronomical significance. And the people who live there today, the Laodacaic, as they call themselves in Gaelic, carry mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that appear at frequencies found nowhere else in Western Europe. These are maternal lineages, passed from mother to child across every generation without recombination, without mixing, like a message written once and copied faithfully forward through time. Geneticists cataloguing the Y chromosome and mitochondrial diversity of Scotland over the past 2 decades have found something that keeps stopping them short. Not because the Scottish genome is entirely alien, it is not. Scotland received waves of migration like everywhere else in Europe. Every people in every country carries within them the genetic residue of those who came before and those who came from elsewhere. But because beneath those layers, beneath the bell beaker farmers who came from the continent around 4,000 years ago, beneath the Bronze Age migrants with their new metallurgy and their new social hierarchies, beneath the Iron Age Celts and the Norse settlers who established themselves in the islands and the far north, beneath the Gaelic speakers who crossed from Ireland in the early medieval period, and beneath all the ordinary movements of people that characterize every human landscape, there is a substrate, a genetic bedrock, a set of lineages that appear to have been sitting in the Scottish landscape for an extraordinarily long time. Lineages that do not match the dominant ancestral signatures of continental Europe and that concentrate most heavily in exactly the places that are hardest to reach, hardest to farm, and hardest to conquer. The Western Islands, the deep glens, the far north. To understand why this matters, you have to go back, not a few centuries, not a few thousand years. Back to the end of the last ice age, when Britain was not yet an island, when the North Sea was a plains landscape teeming with wildlife, a place called Doggerland by archaeologists, where people walked and hunted and lived, and left behind the occasional stone tool that dredging boats haul up from the seabed today. Back to when the question of who first settled the British Isles after the glaciers retreated was very much still being answered by the humans who were doing the settling. The ice that covered Britain during the last glacial maximum, which reached its most extreme extent around 20,000 years ago, was not everywhere uniform. It was deep in the north and the centre, kilometres thick in some places, grinding the bedrock beneath it into the shapes that would become the Scottish Highlands. But there were places where life persisted, even during the worst of it. Southern France and the Iberian Peninsula are the most famous of these refugia, the regions where Ice Age cave art was painted onto limestone walls by people enduring millennia of cold, people who painted horses and bison and lions and rhinoceroses in chambers so deep underground that they can only be reached by crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body. These were people waiting out an ice age, sustaining their culture, their art, their knowledge, their social bonds, in the relatively mild pockets south of the glaciers. But there were other refugia too. The western margins of Europe, where Atlantic Ocean currents kept temperatures marginally more survivable than the frozen interior of the continent. The coasts of what is now Ireland and western Scotland and Wales, where small pockets of humanity may have clung on in conditions we can barely imagine, subsisting on coastal resources, on fish and shellfish and seabird eggs, on whatever the land could offer at the very edge of a frozen continent. These were not comfortable places. They were not warm places. The people living in them were surviving, not flourishing, and the genetic bottleneck of that survival left its mark in the reduced diversity of the lineages that came through it. But they came through, and when the ice retreated, those lineages were there to move north. When the ice retreated, beginning around 15,000 years ago and accelerating around 12,000 years ago, these refugia populations did not simply vanish. They moved. They followed the retreating ice northward, tracking the expanding edge of habitable land, finding new rivers to fish and new coastlines to work and new landscapes to learn. They colonized the newly exposed territory. They were, in the most literal sense, the first people back into Britain after the deep freeze, and they brought with them genetic signatures they had developed in isolation during thousands of years of separated existence from the populations that had taken refuge further south and east. That is the first layer of the Scottish bloodline mystery. These early post-glacial settlers, sometimes called the Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain, were not the same people who later became the dominant ancestral stock of most of continental Europe. They had diverged. They had spent the Ice Age in refugia that kept them genetically isolated long enough to develop distinctive patterns in their DNA that we can still detect today. And the places in Scotland where those patterns are most concentrated are precisely the places that were most likely to have been refugia themselves, or to have been first settled by refugia populations moving north along the Atlantic coast, populations that encountered a landscape that suited them and stopped moving. The technical language geneticists use for these signatures includes terms like haplogroup R1b, L21, and its subclade DF13, and the mitochondrial haplogroups H1 and H3, and their sublineages, and U5 and its various branches. And these designations mean very little unless you understand what they represent in human terms. They represent lineages so old and so specifically distributed that researchers studying them have argued in peer-reviewed journals that they cannot be explained by the conventional models of European population replacement. They are not fully explained by the Bell-Beaker expansion of the Bronze Age. They are not fully explained by any single migratory event in the known archaeological record. They look, to the people who study them most closely, like survivors, like people who were there before the major agricultural transitions and who somehow, in the northwest of Scotland and in the islands, remained there, kept their lines intact, passed them forward through all the subsequent turmoil of European history. This is not a fringe idea being promoted by amateur genealogists online. It is being argued, carefully, and with appropriate qualification and uncertainty, by professional geneticists at institutions like Trinity College Dublin and the University of Edinburgh and the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, in papers published in journals like Nature and Current Biology and the American Journal of Human Genetics. The data is real. The patterns are real. The uncertainty is real too, because this is a young field dealing with fragmentary evidence, and the complete picture has not yet been assembled. Ancient DNA from British prehistoric sites is still being extracted and sequenced at an accelerating rate, and each new dataset adds detail and nuance to a picture that is already remarkable in outline. But the outlines of something genuinely extraordinary are visible, and they point to Scotland, and within Scotland to the Highlands and Islands, as a place where the deep ancestral heritage of Atlantic Europe has been preserved more completely than almost anywhere else. Let us go further back, Because the Ice Age is not the only chapter in this story, and the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are not the only ancient layer in the Scottish genetic palimpsest. There is a site on the coast of Orkney, the archipelago of islands off the northern tip of Scotland, called Skara Brae. It is a Neolithic village, built partly into the ground for insulation and protection against the wind, preserved under sand for thousands of years, uncovered by a violent storm in 1850. When archaeologists excavated it, they found stone furniture, stone shelving, stone hearths, stone sleeping platforms built into the walls of each house. The houses were connected by covered passageways so that inhabitants could move between structures without going out into the weather. The settlement was inhabited continuously for about 600 years, from around 3180 BCE to approximately 2500 BCE. It is older than Stonehenge. It is older than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it sits at the far northwestern edge of Europe, on an island in the North Atlantic, built by people who were already there, who had been there for generations, who had developed a sophisticated material culture in one of the remotest inhabited places on the European continent. The people who built Skara Brae were farmers. They had come to the islands relatively recently in geological terms, arriving as part of the Neolithic agricultural revolution that spread across Europe from the Near East, beginning around 9,000 years ago, reaching Britain around 6,000 years ago. They kept cattle, they grew grain, they made pottery. They had clearly organized social structures and long-term settlement strategies. But the genetics of those Neolithic Orcadians are not straightforward. They show the expected Near Eastern Neolithic ancestry, consistent with the agricultural populations that spread westward across Europe from Anatolia carrying farming with them. But they also show substantial contributions from the earlier indigenous populations, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were already in Scotland and the islands when the farmers arrived. The two populations met and mixed. And in the northwest, in the islands, in the most remote places, the proportions of that mixture shifted in favor of the older indigenous component more than they did in the accessible south and east. This is the second layer, not just post-glacial settlers, but the survivors of the Mesolithic period, the hunter-gatherers who occupied Britain for thousands of years before farming arrived, who did not simply vanish when the farmers came, but who persisted, who intermixed, who passed their genetic material forward into the farming populations that gradually absorbed them. And in Scotland, particularly in the Western Highlands and the Hebrides, that persistence was strongest. The old lineages went further in those communities than anywhere else. They had more time to establish themselves in the genetics of subsequent generations. They left a deeper mark. The Neolithic transformation of Britain was not a gentle cultural diffusion where ideas travelled while people mostly stayed put. Ancient DNA from prehistoric British sites has shown that it was, in genetic terms, largely a population replacement event. The people who farmed the land of Bronze Age Britain were predominantly descended from Near Eastern Neolithic migrants who came via continental Europe, not from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who preceded them. This is a striking finding. It means that the transition to farming in Britain was not primarily about indigenous people learning to farm. It was about incoming farming populations replacing or greatly outnumbering the existing hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers left their genetic mark in subsequent populations, but as a minority contribution, a substrate beneath the dominant Neolithic ancestry, except in some places. Except in the parts of Britain that are hardest to reach by sea from the continent, hardest to farm once you get there, and hardest to displace a resident population from. The Atlantic fringe, Scotland, the islands. Here the replacement was never complete. Here the older genetic signatures persisted at higher frequencies than almost anywhere else in Britain or Europe. Here, when you sample the population today and sequence their DNA and compare it against ancient genomes from across the continent, you find remnants of a genetic heritage that in most of continental Europe has been diluted to near invisibility by the successive waves of migration that swept across the accessible, farmable lowlands over the past 7,000 years. There is a particular Y chromosome lineage called R1b M269 that is extraordinarily common across Western Europe. It accounts for the majority of male lineages in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in Brittany, in the Basque Country, and at lower frequencies across much of the rest of Western and Central Europe. Roughly 80% of Irish men carry it, over 70% of Scots, more than 60% of Welshmen. The numbers across Western Europe are striking for a lineage that is also relatively rare in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, where, by some historical accounts, you might expect to find it in abundance if it had deep European roots. Its origin and its expansion have been one of the most debated questions in population genetics for the past 2 decades. When did it arrive in Europe? Where did it ultimately come from? And why is it so much more common in the Atlantic west of Europe than in the east? The current best evidence, assembled from thousands of ancient DNA samples from across the continent and from genetic dating of the lineage's internal branching structure, suggests that R1b M269, or at least the vast majority of the lineages currently carrying it in Western Europe, expanded dramatically during the Bronze Age, associated with the Bell Beaker cultural complex that spread across Europe beginning around 2800 BCE. The Bell Beaker people, named for the characteristic bell-shaped pottery that appears at their sites from Portugal to Poland, appear to have brought with them this Y chromosome lineage, ultimately from the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea that were the homeland of the Yamnaya culture. And the Yamnaya expansion is one of the most consequential demographic events in European prehistory, a movement of people so large and so genetically distinct from the populations they encountered that it replaced up to 90% of the male lineages in some regions of Europe within the span of a few centuries. But here is where Scotland becomes strange again, because within the larger R1b M269 family of lineages, there is a sub-branch called L21, and within that a further sub-branch called DF13, and these are not evenly distributed across Europe. They concentrate precisely in the Atlantic fringe, in Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Brittany, and within Scotland, they concentrate most heavily in the Highlands and Islands. And within those lineages there are sub-branches that are so rare, so restricted in their distribution, that they appear to exist only in Scotland or in communities with documented Scottish ancestry, and nowhere else in the world. These deeply restricted sublineages are not a curiosity. They are a signal. When a lineage is that geographically restricted, that concentrated in one place and essentially absent everywhere else, it means one of two things. Either it arose in that place through a mutation that occurred there and was never exported because the population never exported itself, or it was brought there by a very small group of people who arrived and stayed and whose descendants never moved away. Either way, it represents a genetic marker of extraordinary local continuity. People whose ancestors have been in the same landscape for so long that their Y chromosomes bear the specific mutations that accumulated in that isolation. Population geneticists, who study what is called the molecular clock, the rate at which Y chromosome mutations accumulate over time as generations pass, estimate that the most deeply branching of these specifically Scottish sublineages began their divergence from their common ancestor, something in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, which places their foundation in the Bronze Age, consistent with the Bell Beaker arrival in Scotland, but at the very earliest stages of that population's establishment in the northwestern Atlantic fringe. And then those lineages sat there, branching slowly, diversifying across the centuries, adding new mutations in the Scottish landscape, without being substantially disrupted by the subsequent population movements that transformed the genetics of most of Europe. They diversified in place. They became Scottish in the most genetic sense possible. The question that follows from all of this is almost vertiginous in its implications. If you could trace those lineages backward, following the branches of the genetic tree, counting the mutations and estimating the generations, how far back would you go? And what would you find when you got there? This is where the story connects to a cultural tradition and an archaeological phenomenon that spans the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. A name that geneticists use carefully because they understand how much controversy it carries. The Atlantic megalithic tradition. Because the people who built the great stone monuments of the Atlantic coast, the dolmens and the passage tombs, and the standing stone circles, and the long barrows that run in an arc from Portugal up through Brittany and Ireland and Wales and Scotland to the Orkney Islands, appear to have been connected. Genetically connected. Not identical across such a vast geographic range, but sharing an ancestry that points to common origins in the Atlantic coastal populations of the early Neolithic. They were the monument builders, the people who looked at a landscape and saw in it places of cosmological significance, hilltops and river confluences and promontories, where something about the geography corresponded to something in their understanding of the world and the sky. And they marked those places in stone, in structures that were designed to last not for a generation but for millennia, not as monuments to individual rulers, but as nodes in a landscape that was itself understood as sacred. And the genetic ancestry that connects the builders of the Irish passage tombs to the builders of the Breton dolmens, to the builders of the Orkney passage tombs, to the builders of the Welsh cromlechs, traces back, once again, to the Mesolithic populations of the Atlantic coast, to the people who were there during and after the Ice Age, to the deep ancestors of the substrate that persists most strongly in Scotland today. Maeshowe in Orkney is a passage tomb. It was built around 2800 BCE, and it is constructed with such precision that on the winter solstice, and for several weeks around it, the setting sun sends a beam of light directly down the entrance passage to illuminate the back wall of the main chamber. This is not accidental. It required planning that extended over multiple seasons, careful observation of the sun's movement along the horizon across the year, engineering skill that produced a structure capable of maintaining its astronomical alignment across more than 4,000 years of slight shifting in the Earth's relationship to the sun. The people who built Maeshowe were not primitive. They were not stumbling through a dark and incomprehensible world. They were sophisticated, cosmologically aware, socially organized human beings with a detailed knowledge of their landscape and their sky that we can barely reconstruct from the archaeological evidence they left behind. And the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the bones of people buried inside Maeshowe and sites like it across Scotland and Orkney tells us that those people carried lineages that were ancient even then. Lineages that had been on the Atlantic coast of Europe for generations before the monument was built. Lineages that in some cases trace back to the post-glacial repopulation of northwestern Europe. Lineages that, if you map their modern descendants, concentrate most heavily in exactly the places where those Neolithic communities lived and died and buried their dead. In Scotland, in the Highlands, in the islands, in the communities that have been in those landscapes longest. Let us talk about what happened next, because the story does not end with the Neolithic. It does not end with Skara Brae and Maeshowe and the ring of standing stones at Callanish on Lewis, which was erected around 2900 BCE. And aligned with the rising and setting of the moon over the southern horizon in a way that connects the monument to the lunar cycle with an intimacy that took modern astronomers considerable effort to reconstruct. What happened next is a series of transformations, each one leaving its genetic mark in the Scottish population, but none of them fully erasing what came before. The Bronze Age arrived in Britain with a rapidity and comprehensiveness that has surprised many archaeologists and stunned some. The Bell Beaker people, those bearers of R1b, who came ultimately from the steppe, transformed the genetic landscape of Britain faster than almost any comparable event in European prehistory. In southern England, ancient DNA analysis has shown that within the space of a few centuries, around 2400 to 2000 BCE, the Neolithic population was almost entirely replaced by incoming Bell Beaker people. The replacement was so thorough that modern southern English people share very little genetic ancestry with the people who built Stonehenge. The builders of Stonehenge were mostly replaced. Their descendants are not primarily in Hampshire or Wiltshire. They are, to the extent they survive at all, primarily in the northwest, in Wales, in Ireland, in Scotland. In the Highlands and the Islands, the Bell Beaker transformation was real. The R1b lineages arrived. The new material culture came. The new social hierarchies associated with Bronze Age society established themselves in the landscape, but the replacement was less thorough. The terrain was less accessible. The existing population had retreats available that the populations of the southern English lowlands did not. And the consequence is that the Neolithic and pre-Neolithic genetic heritage persisted in Scotland at higher frequencies than it did south of the Highlands. The Iron Age arrived, and with it the cultures we group loosely under the Celtic label, bringing languages and material culture that spread across much of Europe and reached Britain from the continent over an extended period. But the genetic signature of the Iron Age Celtic expansion in Britain is complex and disputed. It does not appear to represent a single massive population replacement on the scale of the Bronze Age transition. It looks more like a cultural and linguistic shift that overlaid existing populations to varying degrees, changing what people spoke and how they decorated their pottery and what weapons they carried, without necessarily displacing them in large numbers from the landscape. In Scotland, the populations onto which this Celtic cultural layer was overlaid were already a specific mixture of the very old and the somewhat old, of Mesolithic survivors and Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age newcomers, and the Iron Age Celtic cultural influence came on top of that existing mixture rather than replacing it. The Romans came, and the Romans notably stopped at what became the Scottish border, more or less. They built Hadrian's Wall across northern England, and later the Antonine Wall further north, not because they ran out of territory to the north, but because the territory to the north was occupied by people they could not subdue and did not consider worth the resources to subdue. The Caledonians, the Métis, the various peoples who occupied what is now Scotland were, from the Roman perspective, simultaneously too fierce and too poor to bother with. The famous passage in the Roman historian Cassius Dio, written in the 3rd century CE, describes the Caledonians as living in tents, going naked, and sharing their women communally, which tells you more about Roman ethnographic prejudice than about actual Caledonian social organization, but does convey the Roman sense that these were profoundly foreign people, living in a profoundly foreign way. The peoples whose genetic heritage would become a significant component of the Scottish population going forward were those who sat behind the wall and who the Romans wrote about with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. And among these peoples, the most historically significant and the most genuinely mysterious were the Picts. The Picts are one of the genuine historical mysteries of the British Isles. They are first mentioned in Roman sources in the late 3rd century CE, where they appear as inhabitants of northern and central Scotland, north of the Forth Clyde line. The Romans called them Picti, the painted ones, though whether this refers to tattooing or body painting, or is simply a convenient Latin label for a group of people, the Romans never took the trouble to understand properly, is not entirely clear. The Picts had their own king list, going back to the early centuries of the Common Era. They had a written script, a form of Ogham different from the Irish version. They had art of extraordinary quality, the carved symbol stones that still stand across Scotland from Shetland to Fife, bearing a visual vocabulary of symbols, double discs and zerods and serpents and abstract geometric forms that has not been deciphered despite generations of scholarly effort. The Picts appear to have practiced some form of matrilineal succession at certain points in their history, a practice unusual enough in early medieval Europe to attract comment from contemporary writers and to generate centuries of subsequent speculation about what it meant and where it came from. They appear to have been formidable warriors, successfully resisting Anglian expansion from the south at the Battle of Nectansmere in 685 CE, a victory whose consequences shaped the long-term political geography of Scotland. And then, in the 9th century CE, they seem to have merged with, or been absorbed, by the Gaelic-speaking Dal Riata kingdom, to form the Kingdom of Alba, and they disappear from the historical record as a distinct people, their language lost, their distinctive material culture submerged into the new Gaelic-Scottish synthesis. But the Picts do not disappear from the genetic record. Their descendants continue to live in the same landscape. They are there in the genomes of the modern Scottish population. And what the genetics shows, when ancient DNA from early medieval Scottish sites associated with Pictish culture is examined, is exactly what you would expect. The Pictish populations show ancestry consistent with the long-term inhabitants of Scotland, a mixture of the Atlantic, Neolithic and Bronze Age Bell Beaker ancestry that characterises the broader Scottish genetic profile, without strong signals of recent migration from continental Europe or from the south of Britain. They were, in genetic terms, essentially local. They were the people who had been in Scotland for the preceding generations, traceable back through the Bronze Age and the Neolithic to the earliest post-glacial settlers of the landscape, and they passed that ancestry forward into the medieval Scottish kingdoms that succeeded them. The Norse settlement of Scotland is the other major medieval demographic event that shaped the Scottish genetic landscape, and it was substantial. Beginning in the late 8th century CE, with the first raids on coastal monasteries, The Norse presence in Scotland escalated through the 9th and 10th centuries into genuine settlement, colonization of the Orkney and Shetland Islands so thoroughly that they became, for all practical purposes, Norse territories. Norse Norn, a language derived from Old Norse, was spoken in Orkney and Shetland until the 18th century, coexisting with Scots and eventually being displaced by it. The Hebrides, which the Norse called the Southerager, the Southern Isles, also experienced substantial Norse settlement, though never as completely as the Northern Islands. The genetic signature of this Norse settlement is visible in the modern Scottish population and particularly clear in the Northern Islands. Y chromosome lineages with unambiguous Scandinavian origins are found in Orkney and Shetland at frequencies that clearly reflect the scale of Norse colonization. Studies specifically examining the Orcadian genetic profile have found that a substantial proportion of both the male and female lineages in Orkney trace to Scandinavian origins, consistent with the historical accounts of Norse settlement. But even in Orkney, even in the most thoroughly Norse-settled parts of Scotland, the pre-Norse substrate is still detectable. There were people in Orkney before the Norse arrived, people who had been there for thousands of years, and their genetics persists beneath the Norse layer, measurable, identifiable, pointing back to the same ancient Atlantic heritage that characterizes the rest of the Scottish Highland and Island population. In the Western Isles, the Norse impact was significant, but less complete than in Orkney. The Hebrides show Norse admixture that is consistent with settlement and intermarriage over several centuries, but the pre-Norse population was not displaced. It absorbed the incoming Norse element while retaining substantially more of its ancient ancestry than the Northern Islands did. Which means that the Western Isles today present a genetic profile that is a specific mixture of ancient Atlantic heritage and Norse admixture overlaid on the Bronze Age and Neolithic layers that came before, and that nowhere in this mixture did any single incoming wave eliminate what was already there. This is the consistent theme of Scottish genetic history. Not purity, not isolation, not a population that somehow remained untouched by all the demographic upheavals of the past 10,000 years. The Scottish Highlands and Islands were never isolated. They received migration. They experienced conquest and settlement. But they received and experienced these things in ways that added to, rather than eliminating the existing genetic heritage. Each layer was real, but the layer beneath it survived. Now let us engage with the question that the genetics raises most directly. Why? Why did the ancient genetic heritage survive in Scotland more completely than almost anywhere else in Northern Europe? And the answer has several parts, all of them interrelated. The first part is geography, and it is the most obvious. The Scottish Highlands are mountains, serious mountains, not the gentle rolling hills of the English Lake District or the Pennines, but steep, trackless, genuinely inhospitable terrain that makes movement difficult and discourages the kind of large-scale agricultural settlement that drives population replacement. The Western Highlands are not just mountainous, they are also cut by the sea. The sea locks reach deep into the land, dividing it into peninsulas that are almost islands, making overland travel into routes that require significant detour or the ability to navigate by water. And the Hebrides are islands, actual islands, requiring boats to reach, exposed to Atlantic weather, with limited agricultural potential compared to the mainland lowlands. To settle the Scottish Highlands in force, to bring in enough people to displace an existing population rather than simply mixing with it, you need resources of transportation and logistics that were genuinely difficult to assemble in the ancient and early medieval world. The terrain that made life difficult for the existing population also made it difficult for anyone trying to replace them. This is a consistent dynamic in demographic history. The hard places keep their people. The easy places lose theirs. The second part is cultural, specifically the nature of the social organization that characterized Highland communities through the medieval and early modern periods. The Scottish clan system is often understood through the lens of its later romanticization, the kilts and tartans and clan chiefs of the 18th century, the pageant that Walter Scott helped to orchestrate for the visit of George IV to Edinburgh in 1822. But the clan system had deep roots that predated the romanticization by many centuries, and at its foundation, it was a system of kinship-based social organization that had significant consequences for genetic continuity. Clan members identified themselves as descended from a common ancestor, often traced back through dozens of generations to an individual who was sometimes historical and sometimes legendary and sometimes both. Marriages within the clan, or between specific allied clans, were preferred, not from any genetic awareness, but from the social logic of alliance building and the practical realities of community life in a geographically restricted landscape. Migration away from the clan territory was possible and happened regularly in specific circumstances, but it was not the default expectation. People lived where their families had lived. They married their neighbors, or the neighbors of their neighbors, within a landscape that had defined social and cultural meaning that was inseparable from the physical geography. The genetic result of this kind of cultural geography is exactly what we see in the Scottish Highlands today. The lineages stayed close to home. The Y chromosomes diversified in the same glens where they had settled. The mitochondrial lineages were passed from mothers to daughters who married into the next glen over, not across the continent. And over the generations, the genetic distinctiveness of the Highland population was maintained not by isolation, but by a social system that naturally reproduced itself in the same physical space. The third part of the answer is what happened in the periods when outside pressure was greatest. The Roman period is illustrative. The Romans were formidably efficient at establishing military control over populations they could reach, but they could not easily project military force into the mountainous northwest of Scotland. They tried on several occasions. The Agricola campaigns of the late 1st century CE penetrated into the Scottish Highlands, with the general Gnaeus Julius Agricola reportedly reaching the far north before the military situation in other parts of the empire forced the withdrawal of legions from Britain. The Roman historian Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law and therefore not entirely objective, describes a great battle at a place called Mons Graupius, somewhere in northern Scotland, at which the Caledonians were defeated in open battle. But they were not subjugated. After the battle, according to Tacitus, the Caledonians dispersed into their hills and woods, and the Romans did not pursue them. The dispersal into hills and woods. That is the key phrase. That is the strategy that the terrain made available and that the Caledonian population consistently deployed. Not stand and fight until you are destroyed. Not flee and never return. Withdraw into the landscape that the invaders cannot follow, wait out the military expedition, and return when it has ended. And the Roman expeditions did always end. The logistics of maintaining a military presence in the far north of Britain were too demanding for the benefits the territory offered. The Romans consolidated at Hadrian's Wall and eventually at the Antonine Wall, and the population north of those walls maintained its independence, its culture, and its genes. This strategic withdrawal into difficult terrain is not unique to Scotland. You find similar dynamics wherever mountain or island geographies have allowed populations to resist displacement over long periods. The Basques in the Pyrenees, the Berbers in the Atlas Mountains, the Welsh in their hills, the Irish in the west of their island. These are all populations that the successive waves of European demographic change could not fully reach, could not efficiently displace, and whose genetic heritage is correspondingly older and more continuous than that of the more accessible lowlands around them. But Scotland, and specifically the Scottish Highlands and Islands, represents an extreme case. The combination of mountain terrain, island geography, a cultural system that maintained community cohesion over long periods, a linguistic tradition that carried old knowledge and old identities forward through time, and a historical position at the far northwestern edge of European civilization that made it a place other peoples came to settle, but not a place they came to in large enough numbers to achieve demographic replacement. All of these factors combined to produce a population that is genuinely unusual in the genetic landscape of Northern Europe. Let us now discuss the Basques in more detail, because the Basque connection to Scotland is one of the more unexpected threads in this story, and it illuminates the wider picture of Atlantic European genetic history in a way that the Scottish case alone cannot fully convey. The Basque people of northern Spain and southwestern France are, like the Scottish Highlanders, genetically distinctive in a way that cannot be fully explained by the conventional models of European demographic history. They speak a language, Euskara, that is a language isolate, related to nothing else currently spoken or historically attested anywhere in Europe or indeed in the world. Euskara has no known relatives. It stands alone in the linguistic landscape of Europe as the survivor of whatever languages were spoken in Western Europe before the Indo-European family spread across the continent beginning in the Bronze Age. The Basques managed to retain their ancient language through all the demographic upheavals of the past 4,000 years in a way that no other Western European population did. The Romans did not replace Basque with Latin, or not completely. The Germanic migrations of the migration period did not replace it. The subsequent kingdoms and empires that washed over southwestern Europe did not replace it. Euskara persisted. And the Basque genetic profile is, like their language, anomalous. They carry Y chromosome R1b lineages at extraordinarily high frequencies, among the highest in the world. More than 80% of Basque men carry R1b, and within the Basque R1b, the diversity structure suggests that those lineages have been in the Basque country for a very long time, diversifying on Basque soil in the same way that specifically Scottish lineages have been diversifying in the Scottish Highlands. When geneticists began comparing the Basque genetic profile to other European populations, looking for their closest relatives, they consistently found that the populations most genetically similar to the Basques are not their Spanish and French neighbours, despite centuries of geographic proximity and intermixture. They are the populations of the Atlantic, Celtic fringe, the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scots, particularly the Scots of the Highlands and Islands. This is not because the Basques and the Scots have had recent contact, or because there was some historically documented migration between the Pyrenees and the Hebrides. It is because both populations are, to an unusual degree, the genetic heirs of the same ancient Atlantic coastal populations that occupied the Atlantic fringe of Europe after the Ice Age. Both populations have retained, at higher frequencies than their geographic neighbours, the ancestral genetic signatures of those Atlantic, Mesolithic, and early Neolithic peoples. They are, in a very real sense, cousins who have been separated for thousands of years, but who carry in their blood the memory of a shared ancestors that predates the cultures and kingdoms and languages that now distinguish them. The Basque linguistic isolation mirrors their genetic isolation, and both mirror the Scottish linguistic and genetic distinctiveness. These are the survivors, the keepers of something very old that most of Europe has diluted or lost entirely. And the fact that they persisted at opposite ends of the Atlantic fringe of Europe, separated by the entire length of France and the Bay of Biscay, separated for perhaps 10,000 years of independent demographic history, and yet are still recognizably related when you look at the right genetic markers, is a measure of how deeply ancient the shared ancestry is, and how effectively the Atlantic coastline functioned as a refuge during the turbulent demographics of European prehistory. There is a mitochondrial lineage called U5, and it deserves more attention than we have yet given it, because it is one of the most ancient human lineages found in Europe today, and it is essential to understanding the deepest layer of the Scottish genetic heritage. U5 and its sublineages, particularly U5A and U5B and their various branches, are the characteristic mitochondrial DNA of the European Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. These are the maternal lineages of the people who hunted reindeer and aurochs in the forests that grew back after the glaciers retreated. The people who fished the rivers and gathered shellfish from the coastlines. The people who made microliths from flint and bone tools from the animals they killed, and who left behind painted pebbles and ochre-covered bones and other traces of a rich spiritual life that we are only beginning to reconstruct from. The archaeological record. These are the lineages of the first fully post-glacial Europeans. U5 is found across Europe today, but at low frequencies in most places. It was largely diluted by the Neolithic expansion, when the incoming farming populations with their very different mitochondrial heritage, predominantly H lineages, came to dominate the European mitochondrial landscape, and it was diluted again by the Bronze Age expansion. In most of continental Europe, U5 survives only as a small fraction of the modern population's mitochondrial diversity, a remnant of the ancient hunter-gatherer heritage buried beneath thousands of years of subsequent mixing. It survives at higher frequencies in the populations that were most isolated from the mainstream of European demographic history. In Finland and among the Sami people of Norway and Sweden and Finland, because those populations were isolated in the far north of Scandinavia, where the Neolithic and Bronze Age agricultural expansions came late and incompletely. And in Scotland, particularly in the Western Highlands and the Hebrides, because those populations were isolated in the far northwest of the British Isles, at the very edge of the habitable world, where the successive waves of continental migration reached last and with least force. When a Scottish Highlander today carries a U5 mitochondrial lineage, they are carrying a direct genetic connection to the hunter-gatherer populations of post-glacial Europe. Not through a complex chain of mixture and dilution that might leave only a fraction of a percent of ancient ancestry diffused across thousands of genes, but through a line of maternal descent, mother to daughter to granddaughter, that has been in Scotland, possibly, for 10,000 years or more. That is what is sitting in the blood of some people in Assynt and Ardnamurchan and South Uist and the Isle of Harris. A line of mothers going back to a time before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before writing, before cities, before farming reached the Atlantic coast. A genetic thread stretching back to the Ice Age. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry, though it does have a quality of poetry about it. This is what the DNA says when you sequence it and compare it against the ancient genomes and the modern population surveys and the archaeological record. And understanding what it means requires sitting with the numbers for a moment, because the numbers are quietly staggering in their implications. Consider a single U5 mitochondrial lineage in a woman living in Stornoway today. Her mother had it. Her mother's mother had it. And her mother's mother's mother, going back in an unbroken chain of female descent, each link a woman who carried the same mitochondrial DNA to the next generation, each link a life lived, children raised, the lineage passed forward. If you go back 250 generations, which is roughly 5,000 years, you are back to the Neolithic period in Scotland. If you go back 400 generations, roughly 8,000 years, you are in the Mesolithic, the period of the hunter-gatherers, the period before farming reached the Atlantic coast. And a U5 lineage that is among the more deeply branching variants could conceivably connect back to that period or earlier. The persistence of that lineage is not passive. It is not just inertia, not just the random survival of a genetic variant that happens not to have died out. It is the consequence of thousands of individual choices, thousands of marriages that stayed within a relatively small geographic community, thousands of children who survived and had children of their own, thousands of generations of people who lived and died in the same landscape and passed their mitochondria forward. The genetics is a record of human lives. Each U5 lineage in the Scottish Highlands is a compressed biography of 10,000 years of local continuity. It is a genetic palimpsest in which you can still read the earlier script. There is a genetic project called The People of the British Isles, a large-scale population study that sampled over 2,000 people born in rural areas of Britain whose 4 grandparents were all from the same area. This design was intended to remove the confounding effects of modern mobility and produce a genetic map of historical British population structure. The structure that existed before trains and aeroplanes made it easy to move anywhere in the country. The results, published in 2015 Inches, the journal Nature, produced a map of genetic clusters across Britain that was, to the researchers' own considerable surprise, almost perfectly correlated with the pre-Norman political boundaries of the country. This means that the genetic structure of Britain today still reflects the political and cultural geography of Britain more than 1,000 years ago. The Norman conquest of 1066 CE did not erase the genetic boundaries established by the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the various Celtic polities. The Industrial Revolution did not homogenize the British population into a single undifferentiated mass. Modern mobility has changed things substantially, particularly in the cities, but in the rural areas where the study focused, people in 2015 were still genetically more similar to their geographic neighbours than to people in the next county, let alone the next country. People in the Highlands were genetically distinct from people in the Lowlands. People in Orkney were genetically distinct from people in Shetland and from people on the Scottish mainland. People in the Hebrides formed their own cluster. The genetic landscape of Scotland was not a uniform surface, but a complex mosaic of ancient local populations, each with its own specific signature, each reflecting thousands of years of relatively contained demographic history. And when the researchers looked at where in Europe these Scottish clusters found their closest continental relatives, the answers were not straightforward. The Orkney cluster showed strong Norse ancestry, unsurprising given the historical depth of Norse settlement in those islands. The lowland Scottish cluster showed connections to Northern English populations and to Scandinavian populations. But the Highland and Hebridean clusters showed something different. Their closest continental relatives were, consistently, in the Atlantic fringe, in Ireland and Wales and Brittany and the Basque Country, not primarily in Scandinavia, not primarily in Central Europe, on the Atlantic coast, always the Atlantic coast. The ancient DNA revolution has been transforming our understanding of European prehistory at a rate that is genuinely breathtaking, and the Scottish data is an important part of this transformation. Ancient DNA from Scottish prehistoric sites has been gradually appearing in the scientific literature over the past decade, extracted from skeletal remains that have survived for thousands of years in the particular preservation conditions of Scottish soils and cave environments, and some of the results have been genuinely surprising. A study examining prehistoric genomes from across Britain included samples from Scottish Neolithic sites, and found that the Scottish Neolithic individuals showed a higher proportion of indigenous hunter-gatherer ancestry than Neolithic individuals from comparable sites in southern England. This is consistent with what the modern population surveys had suggested, that the northwest of Britain retained more of the indigenous pre-farming genetic heritage than the south and east. But it is striking to see it confirmed directly from the bones of people who lived there 5,000 years ago. The pattern that we can detect in the modern population was already there in the ancient population. The distinctiveness of the Northwest goes back at least to the Neolithic period, and probably much further. More surprising were the indications from some Scottish Bronze Age samples that the transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age genetics was less abrupt and less complete in Scotland than in England. The mass replacement of Neolithic ancestry by Bell Beaker ancestry that appears to have occurred in southern Britain within a few centuries, around 2400 to 2000 BCE, was, in Scotland, a more gradual and less thorough process. The Neolithic ancestry persisted longer. The indigenous populations persisted alongside the incoming Bronze Age peoples for longer, and the ultimate mixture that resulted was weighted differently, with a higher proportion of the older Neolithic and even Mesolithic ancestry in the resulting population than you find in comparable Bronze Age populations from England or from continental Europe. These are findings from studies with relatively small Scottish sample sizes, and the picture will become much clearer as more sites are excavated and more samples are sequenced. The field is moving fast. New sites are being identified. New extraction methods are making it possible to obtain usable DNA from older and more fragmentary remains. New analytical techniques are allowing finer-grained resolution of genetic relationships. Within the next decade, the ancient DNA map of Scotland will be many times more detailed than it is today. But the direction in which the current evidence is pointing is consistent and reinforcing. Scotland is a place where the oldest genetic signatures of European prehistory survived most robustly, and the most remote and inaccessible parts of Scotland are the places where they survived most robustly of all. The Cheddar-Man connection is worth dwelling on because it has a directness and a human specificity that makes the abstract genetics suddenly concrete and personal. Cheddar-Man was a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer whose skeletal remains were found in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset in 1903. He lived approximately 9,000 years ago. For most of the century after his discovery, he was simply the oldest complete human skeleton found in Britain, an archaeological curiosity from the Stone Age. But in 2018, researchers from the Natural History Museum in London and University College London published the results of a genetic analysis of Cheddar-Man's genome that attracted enormous public attention and some heated debate, primarily because the analysis concluded that Cheddar-Man almost certainly had dark to very dark skin, with high probability of blue or green eyes. The combination surprised people because it did not match the expected appearance of ancient Britons, who many had implicitly imagined as similar in appearance to modern British people. The reality, the genetics showed, was more complex. But the finding about Cheddar-Man's appearance was not the most scientifically significant result of the analysis. The most significant finding was about his mitochondrial lineage. Cheddar-Man's mitochondrial DNA belongs to haplogroup U5b, one part of the U5 family, the hunter-gatherer lineage we have been discussing. And when the researchers compared Cheddar-Man's genome against contemporary British people, Looking for the closest modern genetic relatives, they found them not in Somerset, not anywhere near the cave where he was buried, but concentrated in Western Britain and in Scotland, in the communities that have retained the highest frequencies of ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry. The implication is powerful and specific. The people of the Atlantic fringe of Britain are, genetically, the closest living descendants of the people who were in Britain before farming arrived. Not because they are pure descendants, unmixed and unchanged across 9,000 years, they are clearly not, but because the mixing that diluted those ancient lineages everywhere else in Britain and Europe has, in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, diluted them least. Cheddar Man's closest living genetic relatives, the people who share most of his maternal ancestry, are the people of the Western Highlands and the Hebrides. Think about the strangeness of that. The oldest complete human skeleton ever found in Britain, 9,000 years old, buried in a cave in Somerset, 300 miles from the Scottish border, and his closest living genetic community is in the Outer Hebrides. His lineage left southwestern England, or was replaced there by subsequent populations, and found its greatest survival rate at the northwestern extreme of the British Isles. The Atlantic fringe. Always the Atlantic fringe. Let us now talk about the clearances, because no account of Scottish genetic history can be complete without them, and because they represent the most acute threat that the ancient Scottish genetic heritage has faced in the historical period, a threat that came very close to eliminating it entirely within a matter of generations. Between roughly 1,750 and 1,860, the Highland clearances displaced tens of thousands of people from their ancestral lands in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. The mechanism was straightforward. Landlords, responding to the economic opportunities created by the wool trade, found that sheep farming was more profitable than the existing system of small-scale subsistence agriculture that supported the crofting communities. Converting to sheep farming required the removal of those communities. People who had lived in specific glens and on specific islands for generations, whose families had been in those places for as long as anyone could trace, whose genetic heritage went back through all the layers we have been discussing, were evicted, told to leave, taken to coastal crofts where the land was poorer and the fishing grounds unfamiliar, put on ships, sent to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, to any place that would receive them. The social and cultural disruption was devastating. The Gaelic language, already under pressure from the spread of English as the language of economic and political power, contracted dramatically. Communities that had maintained it for millennia, passing it from parent to child with all the knowledge and cultural memory it contained, were scattered. The specific knowledge of specific landscapes, the names and histories of specific hills and glens, the songs and stories and seasonal practices tied to particular places, were disrupted in ways from which they have never fully recovered. The clearances were not a genocide in the legal sense, but they functioned as a cultural and demographic catastrophe for the Highland communities, and their effects are still visible in the depopulation and linguistic erosion of the Highlands and Islands today. But the clearances did not eliminate the population entirely. Enough people remained, or enough communities in the most remote and inaccessible locations were spared the worst of the evictions, that the old genetic signatures have survived into the present. And in the diaspora communities, particularly in Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, where Highland Scots settled in large numbers during the 19th century and maintained their Gaelic language and their Highland culture with remarkable tenacity through multiple generations, the genetic signatures were carried across the Atlantic but not lost. The same lineages that have been in the Scottish Highlands since the Bronze Age and earlier are detectable in Cape Breton today, transplanted but intact, still recognisably coming from the specific genetic pool of the northwestern Scottish landscape, even after several generations on the other side of the world. This is one of the more poignant aspects of the Scottish genetic story. The people who were forced to leave took their genes with them, as people always do, and in their new homes they kept enough of their cultural practices and community structures that the genetic distinctiveness, the deep Atlantic heritage, has persisted even in diaspora. When geneticists sample the descendants of the Highland clearances emigrants in Cape Breton or Pictou County in Nova Scotia, they find lineages that belong recognisably to the same genetic cluster as the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. The Atlantic crossed. The people changed. The genes persisted. The Scottish Gaelic language is itself a kind of genetic evidence, because languages are conservative in ways that parallel genetic conservatism. They resist replacement. They carry old information in their structure that no longer exists in the cultures that borrowed from them. And Scottish Gaelic, still spoken today by a community of perhaps 60,000 people concentrated in exactly the same Highlands and Islands, where the distinctive genetic signatures are most concentrated, is a language with roots going back to the Celtic, spoken on the Atlantic coasts of Britain and Ireland in the Iron Age, itself presumably derived from even older Atlantic linguistic traditions that we can only glimpse through the substrate words that survive in place names and in the oldest strata of the vocabulary. The survival of Scottish Gaelic in those specific places, against all the pressures of English and against the disruptions of the clearances and industrialization and the abandonment of the language by middle-class communities seeking social mobility, is a linguistic parallel to the genetic survival we have been discussing throughout this account. The places that kept the old language are also the places that kept the old genes. The connection is not coincidental. It reflects the same underlying reality. Communities that maintained cultural continuity maintained genetic continuity. Communities that sustained the conditions for language survival also sustained the conditions for genetic continuity. The culture and the genes are different aspects of the same phenomenon, which is a population that stayed in its place. There is a concept in ecology called a refugium, a place where organisms survive during a period of wider extinction or displacement, from which they can eventually repopulate surrounding areas when conditions change. The classic Ice Age refugia of southern Europe, the places where trees and animals and plants survived the glacial maximum and then spread back northward as the ice retreated, are refugia in this biological sense. And there is an argument, gaining traction in archaeogenetics, that the western Scottish Highlands and Islands functioned as a cultural and demographic refugium in a similar way during the successive waves of European demographic upheaval of the past 7,000 years. Not perfectly isolated, not unchanged, the genetics clearly shows ongoing mixing with other populations over all these periods, but retaining and sheltering genetic and cultural heritage that elsewhere was lost. If this argument is correct, and the weight of the genetic evidence is accumulating in its favour, then the Scottish Highlanders and Islanders are not just an interesting regional variant in the European genetic landscape. They are custodians, not by intention, not by any conscious decision or self-aware act of cultural preservation in most cases, but by the accident of geography and the determination of people who lived where they lived and stayed where they stayed and loved who they loved and raised children who did the same, generation after generation in a landscape that was difficult and exposed and often harsh, but that was theirs, in a sense that goes deeper than legal ownership and deeper than cultural identity. Theirs in the sense that their genes had been there, accumulating and diversifying and passing forward for longer than most of the monuments and institutions of the civilized world have existed. The research into Scottish genetic history continues, and it is accelerating. The People of the British Isles project produced a landmark map of British genetic structure and has inspired follow-on studies with larger sample sizes and higher resolution. Ancient DNA from Scottish prehistoric sites is being extracted and sequenced at an accelerating rate as new sites are excavated and new laboratory techniques make it possible to obtain usable genetic material from older and more degraded remains. International collaborative projects are comparing Scottish genetic signatures to those of populations across Europe and across the world, looking for connections and divergences that will fill in the remaining gaps in the current picture. What these studies are likely to reveal over the coming years and decades is a picture of even greater complexity and depth than is currently visible. The ancient substrate in Scottish genetics almost certainly has more layers than we have yet identified. There may be genetic contributions from populations we have not yet clearly characterized in the archaeological record, populations that lived in and around Scotland during the deep past and whose descendants merged into the population that became distinctively Scottish over the course of the Neolithic and Bronze Age transitions. There may be genetic evidence of specific historical events whose demographic consequences we have not yet connected to the genetic record. And there are particular sublineages within the broader Scottish genetic profile that have not yet been fully studied, rare variants whose distribution is so restricted and whose internal structure is so deep that they represent, in miniature, the same story of ancient local survival that characterizes the Scottish genetic heritage as a whole. Each of these lineages is a separate thread reaching back into the deep past. Each one is the genetic record of a specific family, a specific set of ancestors who lived in a specific place and passed their genes forward through all the subsequent history of the landscape. When the ancient DNA of Scottish megalith builders is compared to the ancient DNA of Irish passage tomb builders and Welsh long barrow builders, the connections that emerge are not just academic, they are the genetic signature of a cultural world that extended the entire length of the Atlantic coast of Europe, a world whose people shared not just ancestry, but cosmological ideas, architectural techniques, astronomical knowledge, and the fundamental orientation toward their landscape that expressed itself in the building of monuments that have survived them by 5,000 years. The people of that world are gone as a distinct culture. Their languages are not recoverable. Their names are not preserved in any record, but their genes are still here. In Scotland, in the Hebrides, in the glens and the islands of the Atlantic fringe, their descendants are living and working and speaking a language whose roots reach back toward theirs. The standing stones at Callanish-on-Lewis have been in the landscape for nearly 5,000 years. They are not going anywhere. They were built by people who understood that some things need to last beyond a single lifetime, beyond many lifetimes, beyond the memory of any individual who could recall the building of them. They were built to mark something in the landscape and in the sky that those people considered worth marking permanently. And the people who live within sight of those stones today, whose ancestors lived within sight of those stones in every generation since they were erected, carry in their bodies a record that is older than the stones themselves. That record is the Scottish bloodline, not unique in the sense of supernatural origin or special destiny, but unique in the sense of genuine rarity, in the sense of extraordinary continuity, in the sense that the specific combination of genetic signatures that characterizes the Scottish Highlands and Islands, the deep Atlantic heritage layered beneath the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the medieval additions, is found nowhere else in Europe in quite that configuration. It is the product of a specific geography, a specific culture, a specific history of people staying in a specific place for a very long time. It is, in the most biological sense imaginable, a bloodline of belonging. And it is still there, flowing through the people of the Highlands and Islands, connecting them to the builders of Maeshowe and the hunters of the Mesolithic coast, and the post-glacial families who first returned to the landscape after the ice receded. The Atlantic keeps coming in off the open ocean. It has been doing this since before the first humans set foot on the cliffs above it. And on the western edge of Scotland, in the peat bogs and the sea lochs and the exposed moorland and the islands where the light changes every few minutes because the weather is always moving, the people who live there carry something in their blood that most of Europe has forgotten it ever had. A thread going back to the beginning. Thin in places, thick in others, never fully broken, still there. There is a valley in Sutherland, in the far north of Scotland, called Strathneva. It runs from the high moorland down to the north coast, where the sea is cold enough in any month of the year to kill an unprotected swimmer within minutes. The valley was inhabited continuously for at least 4,000 years before the clearances. There are the remains of prehistoric settlements there, the low stone outlines of houses that predate the Roman period. There are Norse-era sites. There are medieval field systems. And, until 1814, there were living communities of Gaelic-speaking people who had been in that valley, in an unbroken chain of residence, since the Bronze Age at least, and probably much earlier. In 1814, they were evicted, not by a foreign invader, by their own landlord, the Countess of Sutherland, who had concluded that the valley would be more profitably used for sheep farming. Her factor, Patrick Seller, oversaw the clearances with a brutality that eventually led to his trial for culpable homicide, though he was acquitted. Houses were burned, people were given days to leave. Some were taken to the coast, where they were expected to survive by fishing, despite having no tradition of deep-sea fishing and no boats capable of it. Others emigrated. Some went to Canada. Some went to Australia. The valley that had been home to a continuous human community for 4,000 years was emptied within a generation. What is significant for this story is not the political and moral dimensions of the clearances, though those are important and their memory is still raw in Scotland. What is significant is the genetic consequence. The people who left Strathnaver took with them genetic lineages that had been developing in that specific landscape for 4,000 years, diversifying in place, accumulating the specific sub-branch mutations that marked them as belonging to that valley. When they arrived in Cape Breton or in Otago or in Gippsland or wherever they ended up, they carried those lineages with them. And in communities where the Highland Scots settled together and maintained their cultural identity through subsequent generations, those lineages have persisted. The diaspora is, in this sense, a dispersal of the ancient Scottish genetic heritage across the world. You can find it in Nova Scotia, and in the North Island of New Zealand, and in the sheep country of New South Wales, and in various parts of the United States, settled by Scottish emigrants in the 18th and 19th centuries. You can find it in the records of Highland regiments whose men were recruited from the Glens and Islands, and who died in wars across the British Empire, leaving no descendants in Scotland or anywhere else, but whose lineages you can reconstruct from the regimental records and the parish registers. The genetic heritage of the Scottish Highlands is not confined to the Highlands. It has been dispersed by history, by ambition, by force, and by the ordinary restlessness of human beings who move when conditions change. But the densest concentration of the oldest lineages is still where it has always been, in the places that kept their people longest. Let us now go deeper into the question of what the most ancient Scottish lineages might actually tell us about the population history of the Atlantic coast of Europe, because this is where the current research is producing its most exciting and contentious findings. One of the persistent puzzles of Atlantic European genetic history is the relationship between the populations of the Atlantic fringe and the populations of the Iberian Peninsula. Both regions show high frequencies of R1b lineages. Both show high frequencies of some ancient mitochondrial lineages. Both show evidence of demographic continuity from the early post-glacial period through the subsequent migrations and cultural transformations. And the specific R1b sublineages of the Atlantic fringe, the L21 and DF13 lineages that dominate in Scotland and Ireland and Wales and Brittany, appear to be most closely related to the specifically Iberian R1b lineages found in the Basque Country and in Western Iberia, rather than to the R1b lineages of Central and Eastern Europe. This has led some researchers to propose what they call an Atlantic route of R1b expansion, in which the Bell Beaker people who brought R1b to the Atlantic fringe of Europe did not come directly from the steppe via Central Europe, but rather came along the Atlantic coast, moving northward from Iberia, along the coastline, through France and into Britain and Ireland. If this model is correct, it would mean that the Bell Beaker people who established themselves in Scotland came from populations that had already been in Iberia for some time, populations that had been mixing with the Mesolithic and Neolithic inhabitants of the Iberian Peninsula and the Atlantic coast of France, and who arrived in Scotland already carrying traces of that ancient Atlantic ancestry alongside their more recent steppe-derived Y chromosomes. The genetic evidence for the Atlantic route hypothesis is not yet conclusive, and the debate about Bell Beaker origins and dispersal routes is one of the most active in current archaeogenetics. But even if the details of the Bell Beaker dispersal route are still being worked out, the genetic connections between the Scottish Atlantic fringe and the Iberian Atlantic fringe are real and are not going away. They represent a deep connection between populations at opposite ends of the Atlantic coast that goes back to before the Bell Beaker period, to the ancient hunter-gatherers and early Neolithic farmers who occupied that coast during the millennia when the Atlantic was a highway rather than a barrier. The Atlantic was a highway. That is a phrase that archaeologists and historians of the Atlantic coast use frequently, and it is worth pausing on it because it changes the way you think about the ancient European world. We tend to think of the sea as a barrier, as the thing that separates places, because that is how it has functioned for most of us in the age before modern ships and navigation. But for people in skin boats or log boats who knew the currents and the winds and the coastlines, the Atlantic was not a barrier. It was the fastest and most reliable route for moving people and things along the coast of Europe. The ancient inhabitants of Scotland were in regular contact with their counterparts in Ireland. We know this from the distribution of stone types used in megalith construction, from the movement of prestige objects, from the genetic connections between the Scottish and Irish populations that reflect ongoing exchange of people as well as things. And those Irish inhabitants were in contact with the inhabitants of Wales and Brittany, and those inhabitants were in contact with the Atlantic coast of Iberia. The whole Atlantic coast of Europe, from Scotland to Portugal, was a network of communities connected by boat travel, by trade, by intermarriage, by the movement of ideas and techniques and genetic material. The standing stone tradition is the most visible archaeological expression of this Atlantic network. The same impulse to mark the landscape with large upright stones, the same basic architectural vocabulary of stone circles and alignments and passage tombs, appears at sites from Portugal to Orkney across a period of several thousand years. The specific forms vary from place to place and period to period, but the underlying cultural logic appears to be shared. And the genetics of the people who built these monuments, insofar as we can currently reconstruct it from ancient DNA, shows the genetic connections of the Atlantic network. The megalith builders of Scotland share ancestry with the megalith builders of Ireland and Wales and Brittany, not because they were all the same people, but because they were all descended from populations that had been connected along the Atlantic coast for thousands of years. This is the world into which the Bell Beaker people arrived. Not a blank landscape waiting to be settled, but a landscape already densely inhabited by communities with thousands of years of local history, with deep knowledge of their terrain and their coastlines, with sophisticated material cultures and cosmological beliefs, with genetic heritages that went back to the post-glacial repopulation of the Atlantic coast. The Bell Beaker expansion disrupted this world. In many places, it disrupted it severely, replacing the male lineages almost entirely, while retaining more of the female lineages. But in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, the disruption was less complete, and the world that emerged on the other side of the Bronze Age transition retained more of the ancient Atlantic heritage than almost anywhere else. And here we arrive at one of the most intriguing findings in the current research. When population geneticists look at the specific configuration of both Y chromosome and mitochondrial lineages in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, and compare it against all other modern European populations, they find that the Scottish profile is in some respects the most similar to what they would expect the ancient Atlantic population to have looked like, based on the ancient DNA data from megalithic sites. Not because the Scottish population is unchanged since the Neolithic, it clearly is not, but because the subsequent additions of Norse and Gaelic and other lineages have been layered on top of an ancient Atlantic substrate that has persisted at higher frequencies than anywhere else in northern Europe. The Scottish Highlands are, in this sense, the place where the ancient Atlantic world is most accessible, the place where you can most clearly see, in the modern genetic data, the genetic world that preceded the Bell Beaker expansion and the subsequent millennia of European demographic turbulence. The genetic archaeology of Scotland is not just about Scotland. It is about the entire ancient world of Atlantic Europe, preserved most completely in the one place that was hardest for subsequent demographic changes to reach. Let us now consider the question of what this all means for how we understand Scottish history and Scottish identity, because these are not purely academic questions. The genetics has implications for how we think about the relationship between people and place, between ancestry and belonging, between the deep past and the present. There is a tendency, in discussions of genetics and national or regional identity, to slide toward one of two problematic positions. The first is the position of genetic essentialism, the idea that genetic ancestry defines identity, that a Scot is someone with Scottish genes, that the ancient lineages somehow determine who the real Scots are. This is both scientifically mistaken, because identity is not determined by genetics, and morally problematic, because it implies that people without the ancient lineages are somehow less genuinely Scottish. The genetics does not support this position. Identity is not in the DNA. The second problematic position is the denial of the significance of the genetic evidence altogether, the argument that ancestry is irrelevant, that all that matters is cultural identification and current belonging. This position, while motivated by an understandable desire to resist genetic essentialism, underestimates what the genetics actually reveals. The genetic evidence is telling us something real about history, about the depth of human connection to place, about the extraordinary continuity of certain populations through thousands of years of change. Dismissing it as irrelevant loses something important. The position that the genetics actually supports is neither of these. It is the recognition that the genetic heritage of the Scottish Highlands and Islands is a historical phenomenon of extraordinary depth and significance that belongs to and enriches the story of all humanity, not just those who happen to carry the specific lineages. It is the recognition that the Scottish people, all of them, those who carry the ancient Atlantic lineages and those who do not, are the heirs of a history that is longer and more complex and more remarkable than the conventional accounts usually convey. And it is the recognition that the deepest layers of that history, the layers that go back to the Ice Age and the post-glacial repopulation and the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the megalith builders, are accessible to us through the genetics in a way that was not possible even 20 years ago. The great Scottish philosopher and historian Thomas Carlyle, writing in the 19th century, said that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. This was always an inadequate account of history, ignoring as it does the vast majority of human experience that does not involve great men or their deeds. But the genetics suggests an alternative formulation. The history of a people is, at least in part, the biography of all the ordinary people who lived and died in a landscape and passed their genes forward. The genetic record is a democratic history, a history that includes not just kings and warriors and scholars, but every mother who nursed a child, every family that survived a hard winter, every community that stayed together through the upheavals of their age. The ancient lineages in the Scottish genetic record are the biography of ordinary people, people who did not make it into the historical record, people whose names we do not know and will never know, people who lived in the glens and on the islands and fished the lochs and cut the peat and grazed the cattle and raised their children in the specific conditions of a specific landscape, people who had, in all likelihood, no sense of themselves as the bearers of a heritage that would one day be of interest to geneticists. They were just living their lives. But in living their lives in the place where their parents had lived, and their grandparents and their great-grandparents back through the generations, they were maintaining a chain of continuity that has reached, unbroken, across the millennia to the present. There is something in this that is not reducible to science. The genetics tells us that the chain exists, that it is real, that it connects the people of the Scottish Highlands and Islands to the ancient inhabitants of the Atlantic coast in a way that is more direct and more continuous than the equivalent connections visible in most other European populations. But what to make of that connection, what it means in terms of responsibility and belonging and cultural practice and relationship to the land, those are not questions that genetics can answer. They are questions that the people who carry those lineages and the communities that have built their lives in those landscapes are the appropriate people to engage with. The Gaelic tradition has resources for this engagement that the dominant cultural frameworks of the modern world often lack. Dúchas, the concept of belonging to a place in a way that is simultaneously genetic and cultural and ecological and spiritual, is a concept that was developed precisely by people who had this kind of deep relationship with a specific landscape. The Gaelic understanding of the natural world, embedded in place names and seasonal practices, and the oral literature of the tradition, is the product of thousands of years of intimate observation of a specific territory. It is a form of ecological knowledge that is genuinely irreplaceable, that cannot be reconstructed from first principles, that only survives where it has been continuously maintained by communities in specific places. The threat to this knowledge is not abstract. The loss of Scottish Gaelic as a spoken community language, which has been accelerating for generations despite the efforts of dedicated revivalists and institutional supporters, is the loss of the cultural framework within which the ancient relationship between the Scottish Highland communities and their landscape makes most sense. Languages are not just communication tools. They are conceptual frameworks, ways of organizing and relating to experience that shape what is possible to perceive and to think. When a language is lost, the specific way of understanding the world that it encoded is also lost, and no amount of translation can fully recover it. This is not an argument for linguistic purism or cultural essentialism. Languages change, communities evolve, new arrivals bring new perspectives and new knowledge that enrich the communities they join. The Scotland of today is not and should not try to be the Scotland of 1,000 years ago, but the specific heritage carried in the Highland Gaelic tradition, including the deep ecological knowledge encoded in its place names and seasonal practices and oral literature, has a value that extends beyond the communities that have maintained it. It is part of the intellectual heritage of humanity, a body of knowledge and understanding developed over millennia of human engagement with a specific, extraordinary landscape. The genetics and the cultural heritage tell the same story from different angles. They both point to a relationship between a people and a place that is deeper and longer and more continuous than the conventional accounts of Scottish history usually convey. They both suggest that what has happened in the Scottish Highlands and Islands over the past several thousand years is genuinely unusual in the context of European history, and that the communities that have survived in those landscapes are the bearers of something that deserves more recognition and more respect than it typically receives. Let us return now to the specific genetics of a few more lineages that are particularly significant in the Scottish story, because the detail here matters, and the stories embedded in the detail are remarkable. The Y chromosome sublineage, R1b, M222, sometimes called the Nile of the Nine Hostages lineage, in popular accounts of Irish and Scottish genetics, is a large and remarkable cluster of Y chromosomes found predominantly in Ireland and in the Western Highlands of Scotland. The name Nile of the Nine Hostages refers to an Irish high king of the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, who, according to the historical and legendary accounts, founded the Uí Néill dynasty that dominated much of Ireland for several centuries, and whose descendants included many of the most influential figures in early Irish and Scottish history. The popularity of the Nile attribution comes from an early genetic study that found the M222 lineage present at frequencies that seemed too high to explain, except by the differential reproductive success of a particular historical individual and his descendants. The attribution to a specific historical individual is almost certainly too simple. The M222 lineage, when examined with modern high-resolution Y chromosome sequencing, is not a uniform cluster, but a diverse family of sub-lineages, with a common origin that dates considerably further back than Nile of the Nine Hostages. The Y chromosome clock places the most likely origin of M222 in the Bronze Age or Early Iron Age, not the 5th century CE. The high frequency of M222 in Ireland and Western Scotland is the product of several thousand years of demographic expansion, not just one or two generations of unusually prolific reproduction by a single historical ruler. But the M222 story is illuminating for a different reason. It shows how the genetic record interacts with the historical record in complex ways, how easy it is to project historical narratives onto genetic data, and how important it is to maintain the distinction between what the genetics actually shows and what the historical interpretation suggests. The M222 lineage is real. Its concentration in Ireland and Western Scotland is real. Its ancient origin in the Bronze Age Atlantic fringe is, as best current methods can estimate, real. What it does not straightforwardly tell us is the social and cultural history of the people who carry it, the stories of the individuals who passed it forward, the experiences and choices and circumstances that maintained and expanded and sometimes contracted its frequency in specific communities over the millennia. That is always the limitation of genetic history. It gives you the what, but not the why, the pattern, but not the experience. The U5 mitochondrial lineages in the Hebrides tell you that ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry has persisted in those communities. They do not tell you what it was like to be the woman who carried that lineage through a particularly hard winter in the 9th century, or what story she told her daughter about the landscape they lived in, or what she knew about the plants that grew on the machair, and the birds that nested in the sea cliffs, and the fish that ran in the rivers in autumn. That knowledge, if it has survived at all, is in the cultural tradition, in the Gaelic oral literature, in the place names, in the stories and songs that have been passed down alongside the genes. The genetics and the cultural tradition are complementary sources of a history that neither can tell alone. The genetics tells us that the people who now speak what remains of Scottish Gaelic are the bearers of a genetic heritage that goes back to the earliest inhabitants of the Atlantic fringe of Europe. The cultural tradition tells us something about what those people knew and how they understood their world. Together, they sketch the outline of a human story that is remarkable in its depth and its continuity and its resilience. The island of Colonsay lies in the Inner Hebrides, midway between the Mull of Kintyre and the Ross of Mull. It is small, about 12 square miles, with a population today of around 130 people. It has been inhabited continuously since the Mesolithic period. Archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation at Oronsay, the tidal island connected to Colonsay at low tide, from approximately 6,000 years ago, and the character of that occupation, heavy dependence on shellfish and marine resources, movement between sites in a pattern consistent with seasonal resource exploitation, is characteristic of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer way of life. The people who lived on Colonsay and Oronsay 6,000 years ago were the same people, or the close descendants of the same people, who had been on the Atlantic coast of Scotland since the post-glacial repopulation. And some of their mitochondrial lineages are still in Scotland today, not necessarily in Colonsay specifically, because the clearances and the various economic pressures of the past several centuries have dispersed the specific populations of individual islands considerably. But in the Scottish Highlands and islands generally, in the communities that have retained the deepest ancient Atlantic ancestry, the Colonsay shell middens are extraordinary archaeological sites. The shells of limpets and periwinkles and oysters and other shellfish, accumulated over generations of human occupation, preserved in the acidic peat that covers much of the island, have yielded evidence not just of diet but of technology, of social organization, of the tools and ornaments and practices of people who lived there 6,000 years ago. Bone tools, worked antler, perforated shells that may have been used as ornaments, red ochre, the same red ochre that appears in burial sites across Atlantic Europe, from Portugal to Scotland, throughout the period of the megalithic tradition. The same ochre that was applied to the bodies of the dead in rituals, whose meaning we can barely reconstruct, but whose geographical distribution tells us something important about the shared cultural world of the ancient Atlantic coast. Red ochre appears everywhere in the ancient Atlantic world. In the burial chambers of the Irish passage tombs, coating the bones of the dead in a rich crimson. In the Neolithic sites of Scotland, associated with burials and ritual deposits. In the cave art of southwestern France, used as pigment for paintings that are among the oldest art in the world, red ochre does not occur naturally in most of the places where it has been found in ancient contexts. It had to be transported, sometimes over considerable distances, to the places where it was used. This means it was traded. It was considered valuable enough to carry on boats across the sea and in packs over mountains. And this trading of ochre is one of the earliest and one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the existence of the Atlantic network, the system of connections between communities along the Atlantic coast that allowed not just materials but ideas and techniques and people to flow between places that are separated by hundreds of miles of open water. The trading of ochre connects the people of the Colonsay shell middens to the people of the Irish passage, tombs to the people of the Breton dolmens, to the people of the Portuguese cromlechs. It is a small piece of evidence, but it is the kind of small piece that, accumulated with many other small pieces from many different types of evidence, builds into a picture of a connected ancient world whose full extent we are only now beginning to appreciate. And in that ancient connected world, Scotland was not the remote periphery it sometimes appears to be in accounts focused on the classical Mediterranean world. It was a part of the Atlantic network, connected by sea to Ireland and to Britain and to the continent, sharing in the cultural and demographic exchanges that characterized that network for several thousand years. The genetics reflects this. The deep similarity between the ancient lineages of Scotland and those of Ireland and Wales and Brittany is the genetic signature of that ancient connection. What makes Scotland distinctive is not that it was isolated, but that it was connected to the right things. Connected to the Atlantic network that preserved the ancient heritage. Disconnected, by geography and culture, from the successive waves of continental migration that disrupted that heritage elsewhere. It is not a story of isolation but of selective connection, of a position on the edge that meant the center could never quite reach in and transform what the edge had kept. The modern genetic sequencing technologies that have made all of this research possible would have been incomprehensible to the people who built Callanish and Maeshowe and Skara Brae. But those people understood, in their own terms, that the landscape they inhabited was not just a physical space but a historical one. The stones they raised, the chambers they built into the ground, the careful alignments they created between their structures and the movements of the sun and moon and stars, all of these were expressions of a relationship with time as well as space. The people who built Maeshowe were placing themselves in a specific moment of astronomical time, the winter solstice, and connecting that moment to the physical landscape through the architecture of the tomb. They were, in their own way, doing history. They were marking the relationship between their community and its place in the larger universe of time and space. The genetics does something similar, though in a very different register. When a geneticist sequences the mitochondrial DNA of a woman from the Isle of Harris and identifies her U5b1 lineage as belonging to the ancient hunter-gatherer heritage of Atlantic Europe, they are doing a kind of archaeology, recovering the record of an unbroken chain of mothers stretching back through the generations to people who lived in a very different world, but who were, in the most fundamental biological sense, the same kind of creature as the woman whose DNA is now being read. The genetics marks the relationship between a living person and the entire history of human presence in their landscape. It is, in its own way, a form of memory. And memory is what this whole story is really about. Not just the memory preserved in DNA, which is real and remarkable but limited in what it can tell us, but the broader human capacity for memory, the transmission of knowledge and experience across generations through the mechanisms of culture, language, story, and practice. The ancient Scottish genetic heritage and the ancient Scottish cultural heritage are both forms of memory, different in their mechanisms and their content, but similar in their function. They are both ways of preserving the record of human presence in a specific landscape across time. The Gaelic tradition has a concept called seanchas, which means roughly old lore or traditional knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of a community about its history, its genealogies, its landscape, its relationship with the natural and supernatural worlds. Seanchas was the domain of the Seanchaid, the traditional keeper of this knowledge, whose role in Gaelic society was to preserve and transmit it, to know the genealogies of the great families and the histories of the great events and the stories of the significant places, and to recite these at appropriate moments in the community's life. The Seanchaid was a living archive, a repository of collective memory whose knowledge was too important to be left to writing, which was unreliable and inaccessible, and which needed to be kept alive through recitation and practice. The Seanchas tradition is one of the ways in which the cultural memory of the Scottish Highland communities has been maintained across the centuries. It is not perfect. Knowledge is lost in every generation through the deaths of elders who have not fully transmitted what they knew. It is subject to embellishment and distortion, the ordinary processes that affect all oral transmission. But it has also preserved things that would otherwise be entirely lost. Genealogies that go back further than any written record, place-name histories that encode knowledge of the landscape accumulated over many generations, stories that carry within them information about natural cycles and resource distributions, and seasonal practices that is genuinely useful as well as culturally rich. The relationship between the Seanchas tradition and the genetics is not metaphorical. The Seanchas preserved, among other things, the genealogies of Highland families, the chains of descent that connected living people to named ancestors going back many generations. Those genealogies are records of the genetic heritage that the genetics is now reading from a different direction. The genetics confirms the depth of the continuity that the genealogies assert. The genealogies give human names and stories to the lineages that the genetics can only trace as anonymous sequences of mutations. Together, they constitute a richer account of Scottish history than either could provide alone. The genetics gives us the deep time, the connection to the post-glacial hunters and the Neolithic farmers, and the Bronze Age diversification of the specific Scottish lineages. The cultural tradition gives us the human experience within that deep time, the stories and practices and knowledge that have been transmitted alongside the genes through the generations of Scottish life. And the archaeology, the physical remains of the stone monuments and the settlements and the grave goods, gives us the material expression of the relationship between the people and their landscape across the millennia. What all three sources, genetics and cultural tradition and archaeology, consistently agree on is the extraordinary depth and continuity of human presence in the Scottish Highlands and Islands. This is not a landscape that was empty until recently, not a place that only became significant when it entered the written historical record. It is a place with one of the deepest continuous human histories in Europe, a place where the relationship between people and landscape has been maintained through all the upheavals of the past 10,000 years, a place where the genetic record and the cultural record and the archaeological record all point in the same direction, toward a story of survival and continuity that is genuinely remarkable. The specific combination of lineages that characterizes the Scottish genetic heritage, the deep U5 mitochondrial ancestry, the H1 and H3 lineages of the Neolithic farmers, the R1b DF13, and its specifically Scottish subbranches, the Norse Y chromosomes in the Northern Islands, all of these together constitute a genetic signature that is the product of this specific history in this specific landscape. It is not found in quite the same configuration anywhere else in Europe, because no other European landscape has the same combination of geographic factors, cultural continuity, and demographic history that produced it in Scotland. And this is why the headline is true, and it is worth returning to the headline at the end of this long account of the evidence and the history and the culture that supports it. The Scots, particularly the Scots of the Highlands and Islands, do carry a bloodline found nowhere else in Europe. Not a single unique lineage, because no such thing exists in a continuously inhabited and intermixing human population, but a specific combination of ancient lineages, maintained at higher frequencies than anywhere else in Northern Europe, constituting a genetic profile that is in its overall configuration genuinely distinctive. It is a bloodline born of the Atlantic, shaped by mountains and sea, and the long persistence of people who stayed in a difficult landscape because it was theirs. It is a bloodline that connects the living to the dead across 10,000 years, across the Ice Age and the post-glacial repopulation and the Neolithic transition and the Bronze Age transformation and the Norse settlement and the medieval kingdoms and the clearances, through all of it, carrying forward the genetic record of every generation of ordinary people who lived and loved and died in the glens and on the islands of the Atlantic fringe of Europe. The Atlantic came in last night, as it always does, cold off the open ocean. It came in the same way it came in 10,000 years ago, when the first post-glacial families found their way to the western coast and looked out at the water and decided to stay. The cliffs are still the same cliffs, the peat bogs are still the same peat bogs, the standing stones are still standing, and the people are still there, carrying in their blood the longest continuous genetic heritage in the Nemitsch's Isles, and one of the oldest in Europe. The thread is very long, and it is still unbroken. You have been listening to a story that is not finished, because the genetics keeps coming. New samples, new analyses, new findings that add detail and nuance to the picture. Within the next decade, the ancient DNA record for Scotland will be many times richer than it is today. Ancient genomes from Mesolithic sites will tell us directly what lineages were in Scotland before farming arrived. Ancient genomes from megalithic tombs will fill in the Neolithic picture. Ancient genomes from Pictish sites will connect the medieval historical record to the longer genetic narrative. And the modern population surveys will continue to reveal the extraordinary detail of regional variation within the Scottish genetic landscape, variation that reflects thousands of years of local demographic history preserved in the DNA of people who have stayed in place. Each of these findings will add to the story. Each of them will make the picture more detailed, more complex, more human. Because what the genetics is ultimately about, what all of this technical language about haplogroups and molecular clocks and population structure is ultimately pointing toward, is people, living real lives, in a real landscape, across a span of time so large that it is almost impossible to hold in mind. People who did not know they were participating in a history, people who were just doing what people do, making their lives in the conditions they found themselves in, passing what they had to the next generation. The Scottish Highlands and Islands are a place where those people stayed, where the generations piled up, one on top of another, each adding its own layer to the landscape and the culture and the gene pool, where the accumulated presence of thousands of years of human life is still visible in the archaeology and in the culture and in the blood of the people who live there today. That is the bloodline found nowhere else in Europe, not a mystery in the supernatural sense, not the product of ancient aliens or lost civilizations or the supernatural origins that the online mythology of genetics tends to attach to genetic distinctiveness, but a mystery in the deepest human sense, the mystery of how people persist, the mystery of why some communities hold on when others scatter, the mystery of the relationship between a people and a place, between genes and culture, between the deep past and the living present. The answer, as far as the genetics can give us one, is this. The Scottish Highlands and Islands are a place that kept its people. The people kept their genes, the genes kept the record. And the record, read now with tools that would have been magic to the people who made it, tells us that the ancient Atlantic world of Western Europe is still alive, still present, still breathing, in the blood of the people who have lived on the cold and beautiful edge of the continent since before history began. The waves keep coming in, they always have. And on the cliffs above them, in the peat bogs and the sea lochs and the islands of the outer Hebrides, the people who carry the oldest continuous genetic heritage in Northern Europe are still there, watching the Atlantic as their ancestors have watched it for 10,000 years and more. Some things last, the stones last, the land lasts, the water lasts, and in the blood of the people who have belonged to that landscape longer than most of the world's civilizations have existed, the memory of those who came before lasts too. That is what the genetics tells us, not just about Scotland, though it tells us a great deal about Scotland, but about what it means for any people to be connected to any place, about the depth of the threads that run between human communities and the landscapes they have inhabited across the generations, about the extraordinary persistence of life in all its forms, including the molecular forms that carry the record of the past in the DNA of every living being. The Scottish bloodline found nowhere else in Europe is, in the end, a story about belonging, about what it means to have been somewhere for a very long time, about the genetic memory that persists in a population that has stayed, against all the pressures that might have scattered it, in the place that shaped it. The Atlantic will keep coming in, and the people will keep watching, and their blood will keep carrying the record forward into a future that the geneticists of that future will be able to read in ways we cannot yet imagine. The story is not finished. It never is. There is a question that this genetic story raises, one that the data alone cannot answer but that the data makes unavoidable. If the ancient lineages of the Scottish Highlands and Islands are as old and as continuous as the evidence suggests, what does that imply about the relationship between genetics and experience? Do the people who carry those lineages experience the landscape differently from those who do not? Is there something in the deep genetic memory of a population that has been in a place for 10,000 years that shapes how individuals within that population relate to that specific environment? This is a question that mainstream genetics is cautious about, for good reasons. The connection between specific genetic variants and specific psychological or experiential tendencies is complex, difficult to study rigorously, and politically charged in ways that have historically led to serious harm. The history of racial science, of attempts to connect genetic ancestry to intellectual capacity or cultural achievement or moral worth, is a history of motivated reasoning producing disastrous conclusions. Any serious engagement with the question of what ancient genetic heritage might mean in experiential terms has to navigate this history carefully. But the question does not go away just because it is difficult. There is a well-established phenomenon in ecological biology called biophilia, the tendency of organisms to have specific responses to specific environmental conditions that reflect the selective pressures their ancestors experienced in those conditions. Humans show stress reduction responses to natural environments, particularly those resembling the savanna landscapes where much of human evolution occurred that are physiological and measurable, not just cultural preferences. We respond differently to open grassland with scattered trees, running water, and expansive views than we do to dense forest or featureless plains, in ways that appear to have evolutionary roots. If biophilia is real, and the evidence suggests it is, then it is at least conceivable that populations with very long residence in specific landscapes might have developed specific biophilic responses to features of those landscapes that reflect their particular selective history in those places, not in the sense of mystical connection or racial memory, but in the mundane sense that populations adapt to the environments in which they live, and adaptation happens at the genetic level, and genetic variants that enhance fitness in a specific environment become more common in populations that live in that environment over many generations. The Western Highlands and Islands present a very specific set of environmental conditions: exposure to high winds and Atlantic weather, dependence on coastal and freshwater resources, navigation in a landscape of sea locks and islands where weather can change rapidly and where the ability to read environmental signals is literally a matter of life and death, long winter darkness at high latitudes, with correspondingly long summer days, specific patterns of seasonal resource availability that required sophisticated knowledge of the local ecology to exploit effectively. These are environmental conditions that have been selecting human genetic variants in the highland and island populations for a very long time, not in dramatic ways, not producing obvious morphological differences from other European populations, but in subtle ways that might affect how individuals in those populations respond to those specific environmental conditions. The genetics of vitamin D metabolism in northern European populations, which has been shaped by the selection pressure of low UV environments, is one example of this kind of adaptation. The genetics of cold tolerance in Arctic populations is another. What specifically the very long residence of the highland and island populations in their specific environment might have selected for, beyond the basic metabolic adaptations to cold and low light that are common across northern European populations, is not currently known in detail. The population genetics research has focused primarily on the ancestry questions, the connections between the highland population and the ancient Atlantic heritage, rather than on the question of specific adaptive variants selected over the long period of residence. That research is harder to do and has proceeded more slowly, but the question remains open and interesting. And in the meantime, the cultural tradition offers a perspective that the genetics cannot. The Gaelic tradition describes a relationship between the highland communities and their landscape that is qualitatively different from the instrumental relationship to land that characterizes most modern societies. Not the romantic idealization of rural life that outsiders have often projected onto the highlands, but a practical, detailed, engaged relationship with a specific environment that reflects thousands of years of close observation and interaction. The kind of relationship that develops when a people and a landscape have been shaping each other for a very long time. The place names of the Scottish Highlands are a record of this relationship. Gaelic place names encode an extraordinary amount of information about the landscape they describe. They note the quality of the grazing, the seasonality of water sources, the behavior of wildlife, the orientation of slopes relative to sun and wind, the presence of specific plants or geological features that have practical significance. They are, in a sense, a map of the landscape as perceived by people who knew it intimately over many generations, a compressed record of ecological observation accumulated across centuries of careful attention. When a fluent Gaelic speaker moves through the highland landscape, reading the place names, they are accessing a layer of environmental information that is not available to someone who does not speak the language. The name of a hill tells them something about its grazing quality. The name of a bay tells them something about its behavior in different weather conditions. The name of a glen tells them something about the kind of life that can be sustained there. This is knowledge, genuine ecological knowledge, encoded in linguistic form and preserved through the cultural tradition. The genetics and the linguistics and the ecological knowledge are all aspects of the same phenomenon, which is the long-term relationship between a people and a place. They are different recordings of the same history, made in different media, with different strengths and limitations. The genetics is the most durable, the least susceptible to corruption or loss, and the most directly readable with modern tools. The linguistics is the richest in its information content, the most connected to the actual experience of living in the landscape. And the archaeology is the most physically present, the most tangible reminder of the depth of the human presence. Together, they constitute an argument for the importance of the Scottish Highland and Island communities that goes well beyond the political and cultural arguments that are usually made in discussions of Scottish devolution or Gaelic language, support, or land reform. They constitute an argument from history, from the deepest history, from the kind of history that only the genetics can fully reveal. These communities are not just culturally significant. They are historically significant in the deepest sense, the sense that matters across millennia rather than decades. The DNA of the Highland and Island communities is a World Heritage resource. It is a genetic record of a way of human life, of a relationship between people and place that has been sustained across 10,000 years, and that is now at risk in ways that the geological and archaeological record cannot be. The standing stones will stand for another 10,000 years. The DNA will be gone if the communities that carry it are dispersed beyond recovery. This is not melodrama. The genetic diversity of any human population is the product of its demographic history, and demographic history is not reversible. If the highland communities are dispersed to the point where the distinctive combination of ancient lineages that characterizes them is no longer maintained in situ, that combination will be lost as a coherent genetic entity, even if the individual lineages survive dispersed across many countries. The context in which they mean something, the specific configuration that reflects the specific history of specific people in a specific place, will be gone. This has happened many times in human history. The genetic heritage of the pre-Columbian Americas was disrupted almost beyond recovery by the epidemics and colonization of the 16th and 17th centuries. The genetic heritage of the Aboriginal Australian peoples was disrupted by the colonial period and the subsequent policies of assimilation and forced removal of children. In both cases, what was lost was not just culture and language, but a specific genetic configuration that was the product of tens of thousands of years of human history in a specific environment. What remains is a fraction of what existed before the disruption, and that fraction is itself under ongoing pressure. Scotland has not experienced anything on that scale, but the clearances were a serious demographic disruption, and the ongoing processes of depopulation and language loss are continuing to reduce the concentration of the distinctive genetic heritage in the places where it was most intensely present. This is not an argument for preventing any mobility or any change in highland communities. Human populations have always moved, and the descendants of the diaspora have built valuable lives in their new homes. But it is an argument for understanding what is at stake in the continued existence of the highland communities, for seeing the ongoing decline of Gaelic and the ongoing depopulation of the glens and islands in the context of a historical importance that extends far beyond the conventional political and cultural arguments. The most ancient genetic heritage of Atlantic Europe is concentrated in these communities. The most complete survival of the cultural tradition that is the human expression of that ancient heritage is in these communities. The responsibility to recognize this and to support the conditions under which these communities can sustain themselves is not just a Scottish political question. It is a question about humanity's relationship to its own deepest history. Let us end where we began, because the ending and the beginning of this story are the same place. The Atlantic coast of Scotland, the cliffs and the sea locks and the islands and the peat bogs and the standing stones. The place where the ancient Atlantic world of post-glacial Europe is most completely preserved, in the landscape and in the culture and in the blood of the people who have lived there longest. There is a beach on the west coast of Lewis called Traim Hor, the Big Strand. It is a long curve of white sand backed by machair, the fertile grassland that forms on the thin layer of shell sand blown inland from Atlantic beaches. The machair flowers in summer in a way that is described by everyone who has seen it as one of the most beautiful natural sights in Britain, a dense carpet of wildflowers running back from the white sand to the edge of the peat bog that covers most of the interior of the island. Corncrakes call from it in the evenings in summer, the corncrake being one of the rarest birds in Britain and one of the most associated with the traditional agricultural practices of the Hebridean communities. People have been at Traim Hor for a very long time. There are shell middens in the dune system that go back several thousand years. There are traces of Iron Age occupation in the machair. There are Norse place names in the area, and there are people there now, living in the township of Tolster and the neighbouring settlements, farming the crofts, fishing the waters, keeping what remains of a way of life that has been in that landscape since before the standing stones at Callanish were erected. Some of those people carry mitochondrial lineages that trace back to the hunter-gatherers who first came to the Atlantic coast of Scotland after the glaciers retreated. Not because they know this, not because it changes anything about how they live their daily lives, but because it is true, and because it connects them, through the most direct biological pathway possible, to the entire history of human presence on the Atlantic fringe of Europe. The genetics is the invisible dimension of a visible story. The story that is visible is the story of the landscape itself, of the stones and the fields and the sea and the sky. The genetics is the record of the people who have been living that story, generation after generation, since the beginning of the human history of these islands. 10,000 years is a very long time in human terms. It is not very long in geological terms. The rocks that the cliffs of Lewis are made of are Lewisian gneiss, the oldest rock surface in the British Isles, formed nearly 3 billion years ago. The people who live on those cliffs have been there for a fraction of 1% of the time the rocks have been there. But, in human terms, in the terms of how long it takes for a population to develop the kind of deep ecological knowledge and genetic distinctiveness that characterizes the highland and island communities, 10,000 years is a very long time indeed. It is, in genetic terms, several thousand generations. It is, in cultural terms, an almost unimaginable depth of accumulated experience and observation and knowledge. And all of that depth is still there, still present, still accessible, in the genetics, and in the culture, and in the landscape itself. The most ancient bloodline in Northern Europe is not a relic or a curiosity or an anomaly. It is a living heritage, still present in living people, still connecting those people to the deepest chapters of European prehistory through the most intimate biological thread possible. The Atlantic keeps coming in, and the people of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, the bearers of the oldest genetic heritage in Northern Europe, keep watching it come in, as their ancestors have watched it come in. For as long as there have been humans on the Atlantic coast of Britain, that is the story that the genetics tells. And it is, by any measure, an extraordinary one. The question of what ancient genetic heritage actually means in practical terms for living communities is one that several disciplines are beginning to grapple with, and the intersections between them are producing some of the most interesting intellectual developments in contemporary scholarship. Archaeogenetics, the combination of archaeology and population genetics that has been the primary scientific engine of the discoveries we have been discussing, is now engaging with indigenous studies, with environmental humanities, with the philosophy of science, and with the communities whose genetic heritage is being studied. These engagements are producing new ways of understanding what ancient DNA research can and cannot tell us, new frameworks for thinking about the relationship between genetic ancestry and cultural identity, and new models for conducting research that respects the communities whose heritage is being investigated. The Scottish situation is different from the indigenous research context in important ways, because the Highland communities are not indigenous peoples in the same sense as Aboriginal Australians or Native Americans. Their history is not characterized by the same degree of colonial disruption, and the research is not conducted under the same legal and ethical frameworks. But there are important parallels. The question of who has the right to study a community's genetic heritage, and what obligations researchers have to the communities they study, is not unique to the indigenous context. And the question of how genetic findings should be communicated to communities whose heritage is being characterized is one that Scottish genetic researchers are actively engaging with. The people of the British Isles PIRO's project, for example, made a deliberate effort to communicate its findings to the communities it studied through public lectures and accessible publications that presented the results in ways that could be understood and engaged with by non-specialist audiences. The finding that the genetic structure of rural Britain still reflects the political geography of the early medieval period was not communicated as a dry academic result, but as a discovery about the depth of community, identity, continuity that had direct resonance for the people in those communities. Similar efforts have been made by researchers working specifically with Scottish populations and Scottish ancient DNA. The challenge is always to present genuinely complex scientific findings in ways that are accurate, that resist oversimplification, and that do not lend themselves to the kinds of misinterpretation that have historically accompanied genetic research into population structure and ancestry. The history of scientific racism, of the ways in which genetic or physical anthropological data was misused to support ideologies of racial hierarchy, creates an obligation on contemporary researchers to be particularly careful about how their findings are framed and communicated. The story of the Scottish genetic heritage is not a story of racial superiority or special genetic endowment. It is a story of historical continuity, of the specific demographic conditions that allowed an ancient genetic heritage to persist in a specific place. It is a story about geography and culture and the ordinary lives of ordinary people who stayed where they were. And in that ordinariness, in the simple fact of staying and continuing and passing things forward, there is a kind of achievement that deserves recognition and respect. The Gaelic word for home is dachai, and it is a word with deeper resonances than the English equivalent. It implies not just the physical space of a house or even a community, but the whole of the familiar world, the landscape and the people and the relationships that constitute the context within which a person is known and knows themselves. The dachai is the world in which your identity makes sense, in which you are recognized and recognize others, in which the specific knowledge and practices and stories that constitute your cultural inheritance have their proper place and function. The genetic heritage we have been discussing is, in a sense, the deepest layer of the dachai. It is the biological record of all the people who have contributed to the making of a specific place as a human world, the invisible presence of all the generations who have lived and died and passed things forward in that place. The dachai is not just a spatial concept. It is a temporal one. It includes the past, all the generations who made the world that the current generation inhabits. To understand the Scottish genetic heritage in these terms, as a record of dachai in its deepest temporal dimension, is to understand it in a way that connects it to the living cultural tradition of the people it belongs to. The genetics is not external to the culture, not an alien scientific imposition on a human reality that existed before and independent of it. It is a different way of reading the same reality that the culture has always known and expressed, the reality of deep belonging to a specific place across a span of time so long that it encompasses the entire history of human life on the Atlantic coast of Europe. There is a song in the Scottish Gaelic tradition called Oran du Ailian Acheo, a song to the Isle of Mist, which is one of the names for the Isle of Skye. It was composed by Mary Macpherson, known as Mairim Hor Nan Oran, Big Mary of the Songs, in the 19th century. At the height of the clearances agitation, when the question of who owned the land and who had the right to remain on it was being fought out in the courts and in Parliament and in the communities themselves, the song expresses a love of the island and a rage at the dispossession that was threatening the communities that had been in those landscapes for generations beyond counting. It is a song about dachai in the deepest sense, about the relationship between a people and a place that no legal instrument of ownership can adequately capture and that no eviction notice can simply erase. The song has been sung at gatherings and protests and cultural events in Scotland for over a century and a half. It has been passed down through generations of singers who learned it from their parents and grandparents and who will pass it to their children. It is part of the living cultural tradition that runs alongside the genetic tradition, expressing in music and poetry what the DNA expresses in molecular biology. The same deep belonging, the same long continuity, the same insistence that this place and these people belong to each other in a way that goes beyond any temporary arrangement of legal or political power. The genetics does not make Mairim Hor Nan Oran's song more true, but it does make it more legible, more historically grounded, more connected to a reality that extends back far beyond the 19th century political context in which it was composed. When she sang of her love for the island and her people's right to remain in the landscape that had shaped them, she was speaking from a position of connection to that landscape that the genetics now shows us goes back to the earliest human presence on the Atlantic coast of Scotland. The love she was expressing was not sentimental attachment to a landscape experienced for a generation or two. It was the cultural expression of a relationship between people and place that the genetics tells us has been building for 10,000 years. That is what makes the Scottish genetic story significant, not just as a scientific finding about population structure and demographic history, though it is a remarkable scientific finding, but as a piece of human history that connects the living to the dead across a span of time that encompasses virtually the entire history of human civilization and extends back beyond it into the deep prehistory of the species. The people who carry the ancient lineages of the Scottish Highlands and Islands are the living end of a thread that began when the first post-glacial families made their way to the Atlantic coast and found it worth staying for. The research into that thread will continue. The ancient DNA will continue to be extracted from the bones of Scotland's prehistoric dead and will continue to fill in the details of the picture. The modern population surveys will continue to reveal the extraordinary detail of regional genetic variation within Scotland, variation that the People of the British Isles project showed us still reflects the demographic history of more than 1,000 years ago. The genetic connections between Scotland and Ireland and Wales and Brittany and the Basque Country will continue to be refined and deepened, revealing more about the ancient Atlantic world that all of these communities share as their common prehistorical heritage. And the Scottish communities themselves will continue to be what they have always been, which is people living in a specific landscape and making their lives in the conditions they find themselves in and passing what they have to the next generation. They will do this with or without the genetic research that is now beginning to reveal the depth of their historical presence in that landscape. They will do it because that is what people do, because belonging to a place means continuing to live there and to work there and to maintain the relationships that constitute the place as a human world. But the genetic research adds something to the picture that was not available before. It adds the deep time. It adds the connection to the Ice Age and the post-glacial repopulation and the Mesolithic hunters and the Neolithic farmers and the Bronze Age diversification and all the subsequent historical layers that have made the Scottish, Highland and Island communities what they are today. It adds the biological dimension of the Dace, the molecular record of all the generations who contributed to the making of these communities and this landscape as a human world. It adds, in short, the knowledge that the thread goes a very long way back, further back than the clan genealogies, further back than the historical record, further back than the standing stones themselves. Back to a time when the Atlantic coast of Scotland was at the edge of the human world, the farthest reach of the post-glacial expansion, the place where the retreating ice met the incoming people, and where some of those people stopped and stayed and began the process of becoming, through 10,000 years of life in a specific landscape, the people that the genetics can now identify as genuinely and distinctively and uniquely Scottish. The Atlantic keeps coming in, cold and enormous, off 3,000 miles of open ocean. The cliffs stand against it, Lewisian gneiss, 3 billion years old, the oldest rocks in the British Isles. And on those cliffs, and in the glens behind them, and on the islands that dot the sea around them, the people whose blood carries the oldest genetic heritage in Northern Europe continue to live, continue to work, continue to pass their languages and their songs and their stories and their genes to the next generation. They do not need the genetics to tell them who they are, but the genetics can tell the rest of us who they are, in terms that go deeper and reach further back than any other kind of evidence. And what the genetics tells us, when we read it carefully and honestly and in the full context of everything else we know about Scottish history and European prehistory, is remarkable. The bloodline found nowhere else in Europe is real. It is ancient. It is the product of a specific geography and a specific history and the specific determination of specific people to stay in a place that was theirs in every sense that matters across the deepest time. And it is still there, still circulating in the blood of the people who live on the Atlantic edge of Scotland, still connecting them, through the most intimate biological thread possible, to the very beginning of human history in the British Isles. That is worth knowing, that is worth celebrating, and that is why this story, long as it is worth telling from the beginning to the end, because the beginning is very far back, and the end has not come yet. The thread continues, the Atlantic keeps coming in, and the people of the Scottish Highlands and Islands keep watching it, as their ancestors have watched it, for longer than almost any other people in Europe have been anywhere, still there, still watching, still carrying, in their blood, the oldest story in the north. There is something that needs to be said about the Picts that we have not yet fully explored, because the Picts represent one of the deepest and most genuinely unresolved mysteries in the genetic and historical study of Scotland, and their story illuminates aspects of the ancient Scottish genetic heritage that no other chapter of the history quite reaches. The Picts occupied the territory north of the Forth and Clyde, approximately from the 3rd century CE, when they first appear in Roman sources, until the 9th century, when the Gaelic Pictish kingdom of Alba was established and the Picts ceased to appear in the historical record as a distinct people. That is roughly 600 years of documented existence as a recognizable cultural entity. But the Picts did not emerge from nowhere in the 3rd century. They were the inhabitants of northern Scotland, the descendants of whatever peoples had lived in that territory during the preceding millennia, the genetic heirs of the post-glacial settlers, and the Neolithic farmers, and the Bronze Age newcomers, and all the subsequent accretions that had produced the population of northern Scotland by the early historical period. The question of what language or languages the Picts spoke is one of the most contentious in Scottish historical linguistics. It is generally agreed that they spoke at least one Celtic language, related to the Brittonic languages of southern Scotland and Wales and Brittany, and some scholars argue that they may also have had a non-Celtic language, possibly a survival of a pre-Indo-European language spoken in Scotland before the Celtic expansion. The evidence for this is the existence of the Ogham inscriptions in Scotland, which contain personal names and other elements that appear to be clearly Brittonic Celtic, alongside names and elements that have not been successfully connected to any known language family. If there was a pre-Celtic language in Pictish Scotland, a language that survived alongside the Celtic language and was still being used in inscriptions in the early medieval period, it would be evidence of an extraordinary linguistic continuity, the survival of a language that predated the arrival of the Indo-European languages in the British Isles. And it would connect the Pictish linguistic mystery to the Basque linguistic mystery, where Euskara represents the survival of a pre-Indo-European language into the modern period. Both would be relics of the ancient pre-Celtic linguistic world of Western Europe, preserved in the places that the Celtic and then the Germanic and Romance linguistic expansions could not fully reach. The genetic evidence for the Picts is still sparse, but what exists is consistent with the hypothesis that the Pictish population represented a specific mixture of the ancient Atlantic heritage and the various subsequent additions to the Scottish gene pool. Pictish archaeological sites, when ancient DNA has been extracted from them, show ancestry consistent with the broader Scottish population rather than representing a distinct incoming population. The Picts were not newcomers. They were the existing population of northern Scotland, with a genetic heritage that traced back through all the layers we have been discussing. What is most interesting genetically about the Picts is not their overall ancestry, but the question of whether their population showed any specific genetic markers that might reflect their long history in the specific environment of northern Scotland. Northern Scotland has particular environmental conditions: high latitude, long winter darkness, extensive coastline, specific patterns of marine and terrestrial resources that might, over many generations, have selected for specific genetic variants. The vitamin D metabolism genetics of northern European populations generally shows evidence of adaptation to low UV environments, and the Scottish Pictish population, with its long history in a high-latitude environment, might be expected to show the results of this selection. This is speculative, because the Pictish ancient DNA samples are few, and the analyses that have been done have focused primarily on ancestry questions rather than on the search for specific adaptive variants. But it is the kind of question that the expanding ancient DNA datasets will make it possible to address in the coming years. And the answer, when it comes, will add another dimension to our understanding of the specifically Scottish genetic heritage. The mystery of the Pictish carved symbol stones deserves more attention. Not because it can be resolved with genetics, it cannot, but because it illustrates something important about the character of the ancient Scottish cultural tradition that the genetics is illuminating from a different angle. The symbol stones are one of the most remarkable artistic achievements of early medieval Europe, and they are entirely specific to Scotland. Whatever the symbols mean, they are not found anywhere else. They are a specifically Scottish visual tradition, developed by specifically Scottish people in the specifically Scottish landscape, and their meaning, if it can ever be recovered, will be part of the specifically Scottish heritage. The combination of the genetic evidence, which shows extraordinary continuity of population in Scotland, and the archaeological evidence of the Pictish symbol stones, which shows an entirely specific and non-derivative artistic tradition, together make a strong argument for the existence of a specifically Scottish cultural inheritance that goes back to a period long before the historical record begins. The Picts did not develop their symbol system from nothing. They developed it from a cultural tradition that had roots in the prehistoric period, in the practices and beliefs and artistic conventions of the people who had been in Scotland for thousands of years before the Roman Empire noticed them. And those practices and beliefs and artistic conventions, in turn, had roots in the ancient Atlantic cultural world that connected the megalith builders and the passage tomb users and the standing stone erectors of the entire Atlantic fringe of Europe. The Pictish symbol stones are the late flowering of a cultural tradition that stretches back to Maeshowe and Callanish and Skara Brae and the shell middens of Oronsay, a tradition whose continuity is expressed both in the cultural record and in the genetic record that runs beneath it. There is a beach on the island of Colonsay called Killaran Bay. It is widely considered one of the most beautiful beaches in the British Isles, a deep curve of white sand backed by dunes, and then Machair, sheltered by the surrounding hills, facing west toward the setting sun. It is the kind of place that has an immediate and powerful effect on everyone who sees it, a combination of scale and light and color and sound that seems to reach something very old in the human nervous system. People have been at Kiloran Bay for a very long time. The Machair, at the northern end of the bay, has yielded traces of human occupation from several different periods. There is Mesolithic material, the debris of people who camped there and used the bay's resources thousands of years ago. There are Neolithic traces. There are Bronze Age remains. There is a Viking burial in the dunes, a Norse warrior buried with his equipment sometime in the 9th or 10th century CE, evidence of the Norse settlement that affected all the Western Isles. And there are the traces of later settlement, the abandoned township of Kiloran, one of the communities cleared from Colonsay in the 19th century. At Kiloran Bay, you can stand on a beach where the human presence stretches back 10,000 years, where every layer of Scottish history from the Mesolithic to the clearances has left some trace. You are standing in the middle of the deep history we have been discussing, not metaphorically but literally. The shell middens are under the dunes behind you. The Norse warrior is in the dunes to your right. The abandoned township is on the hillside above. And the genetics of the people who came from Colonsay, who were cleared from Kiloran in the 19th century and went to Canada and New Zealand and the mainland cities, carries the record of all those layers within it. This is what the genetics tells us about places like Kiloran Bay, not just that people were here, which the archaeology tells us just as clearly, but that the people who were here over the thousands of years of occupation were connected to each other through descent, that the Mesolithic people on that beach contributed genes to the Neolithic people who came after them, who contributed genes to the Bronze Age people, who contributed genes to the Iron Age and Pictish and Norse period and medieval and modern people, all the way down to the people who were cleared from the bay in the 19th century, and whose descendants might today be able to sequence their DNA and find within it, among all the subsequent mixing and dilution, the traces of a lineage that goes back to the people who first camped on that beach after the glaciers retreated. That connection, that biological thread stretching from the present to the deepest human past in a specific place, is what makes the Scottish genetic story so remarkable. It is not unique to Scotland. Similar stories exist wherever populations have maintained some continuity of occupation across the major demographic upheavals of European history. But in Scotland, and especially in the Highlands and Islands, the story is exceptionally clear, exceptionally well preserved, and exceptionally well documented by the combined evidence of genetics and archaeology and cultural tradition. The ancient Atlantic heritage of the Scottish Highlands is not a metaphor for something else. It is a real genetic reality, detectable in modern DNA, traceable through ancient genomes, connected to a specific history in a specific landscape. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the blood that runs in the veins of the people who live in the Highlands and Islands today. And it connects those people, through the most intimate biological pathway available, to the entire deep history of human presence on the Atlantic fringe of Europe. We have been following this thread for a long time now. We have followed it from the Ice Age through the post-glacial repopulation and the Neolithic transition and the Bronze Age transformation and the Iron Age and the Roman period and the Pictish kingdoms and the Norse settlement and the medieval Gaelic-Scottish synthesis and the clearances and the diaspora. We have followed it through the genetics and the archaeology and the cultural tradition and the linguistics, through all the different ways in which human communities record and transmit their history. And at the end of all that following, the thread is still there, still connecting the present to the past, still carrying the record of the oldest continuous human presence in the British Isles. The people of the Scottish Highlands and Islands carry a bloodline found nowhere else in Europe, not because they are special in any hierarchical sense, not because their genes make them better or different in any morally significant way, but because the specific combination of ancient lineages that characterizes their genetic heritage, the deep Atlantic substrate of the post-glacial hunters and the Neolithic farmers, and the Bronze Age diversification of the specifically Scottish R1b sublineages, is a product of a specific history that happened in a specific place and produced a specific genetic signature that is not replicated anywhere else on the continent. That is an extraordinary thing, and it deserves an extraordinary account. The Atlantic is still there, still coming in off the open ocean, 3,000 miles of it, cold and enormous, and ancient beyond reckoning. The cliffs of Lewis and Skye and Sutherland and Ardnamurchan are still standing against it. Lewisian gneiss, 3 billion years old, the oldest rocks in the British Isles. The peat bogs are still there, accumulating slowly, millimetre by millimetre, as they have been accumulating for 10,000 years. The standing stones are still standing. The sea lochs are still cutting into the mountains. The machair is still flowering in summer. And the people are still there. Not as many as there were before the clearances. Not speaking the old language in the numbers that once did. Not maintaining all the old practices in the way that once seemed ordinary and unremarkable. But still there. Still carrying, in their bodies, the oldest genetic heritage in Northern Europe. Still connected, through the most intimate biological thread imaginable, to the very beginning of human history on the Atlantic coast of Scotland. The thread is very long. It reaches back further than most of us usually think about when we think about history. It reaches back before the Roman Empire and before the pyramids and before writing and before civilization as we understand the word. It reaches back to people who left no names in any record, but whose names are, in a sense, written in the DNA of their descendants. People who camped on beaches and hunted in the glens and gathered shellfish from the sea and watched the sun set over the Atlantic and passed their genes to their children, who passed them to their children, who passed them to their children. Across 10,000 years of change and continuity and survival. Those people are still here. Their descendants are still here. Their genes are still here. And that is the bloodline found nowhere else in Europe. There is one more dimension of this story that we have touched on but not fully explored, and it is perhaps the most philosophically rich dimension of all. It concerns the relationship between genetic continuity and cultural continuity, between the biological thread and the human thread, between what the DNA preserves and what the traditions preserve. And it raises questions about memory, about the nature of inheritance, and about what it means for a people to maintain a connection to their deepest past. The DNA preserves the biological record without any conscious participation from the people who carry it. Your mitochondrial DNA does not know it is ancient. It does not know it connects you to the post-glacial hunters of the Atlantic coast. It simply is what it is, a specific sequence of nucleotides that has been copied faithfully from mother to child across the generations, accumulating mutations slowly over the millennia, carrying its record without any awareness of what that record means. The DNA is a passive archive. It records, but it does not understand what it records. The cultural tradition is different. It is an active archive, maintained by conscious effort, by the deliberate transmission of knowledge and practice from one generation to the next. The Shanshade who memorized the genealogies of the Highland families and recited them at gatherings was doing something that required effort and intention, and the recognition that the transmission mattered. The woman who taught her daughter the Gaelic songs she had learned from her own mother was doing something deliberate, something chosen. The community that maintained the seasonal practices associated with the old calendar, that continued to observe the festivals and the agricultural rhythms that connected them to the landscape and to the generations before them, was choosing to maintain a connection that could have been abandoned. This is the difference between the genetic inheritance and the cultural inheritance. The genetic inheritance comes without effort and without choice. You carry your ancient lineages because you were born into a family that carried them, not because you chose to. But the cultural inheritance requires active maintenance. It requires people in every generation to choose to transmit what they received, to teach what they were taught, to sing the songs and tell the stories, and practice the practices that connect them to the tradition. And the cultural tradition has been breaking down in Scotland, in the Highlands and Islands, for several centuries. The clearances disrupted the community structures within which the tradition was transmitted. The schools that replaced the Gaelic language instruction of the old community education system required children to speak English, to orient themselves toward a future defined by the economic and cultural mainstream rather than by the specific heritage of their place. The economic pressures that drove emigration took away from the communities the very people who might have maintained the tradition, the young and the able who went to the cities or to other countries to find work that the depleted Highland economy could not provide. The result is a tradition that is diminished, still alive, still being transmitted in communities and families and schools and cultural organizations that have committed themselves to its preservation, but diminished. The number of fluent Gaelic speakers is a fraction of what it was a century ago. The number of people who can recite the traditional genealogies, who know the traditional ecological knowledge encoded in the place names, who understand the old seasonal practices in their full cultural context, is smaller still. And the oldest knowledge, the knowledge that goes furthest back, is the most vulnerable, because it was held by the people who had learned it from the oldest sources, and those people are mostly gone. This is not unique to Scotland. It is the common condition of minority and indigenous cultural traditions in the modern world, the slow erosion of knowledge that accumulates across generations of disconnection from the conditions in which the knowledge was developed and maintained. And it creates a particular kind of urgency, the urgency of knowledge that is mortal in a way that the genetics is not. The genetic thread continues as long as the biological descendants continue to have children. But the cultural thread requires active maintenance, active transmission, active choice in every generation, and if a generation fails to transmit it, the thread breaks. The combination of the genetic research and the cultural preservation effort is, in this context, particularly important. The genetic research tells us that the communities that maintain the old tradition are also the communities that carry the oldest genetic heritage. The two kinds of continuity, biological and cultural, are concentrated in the same places and in the same communities. And the loss of the cultural tradition in those communities would mean the loss of the human dimension of the genetic heritage, the loss of the experiential and cognitive framework within which the ancient connection to the landscape makes sense as a human reality rather than just as a molecular record. The people who live in the Outer Hebrides today and who still speak Gaelic as their primary language are carrying both kinds of continuity simultaneously. Their DNA connects them to the post-glacial hunters. Their language connects them to a way of understanding and relating to the landscape that was developed by the people who inhabited that landscape through all the subsequent millennia. The two connections reinforce each other. The genetic heritage and the cultural heritage are expressions of the same deep relationship between people and place, read from different angles in different media. Protecting the cultural tradition is, in this sense, also protecting the human meaning of the genetic heritage. It is maintaining the context in which the ancient lineages are not just molecular curiosities, but living expressions of a specific and ongoing relationship between a people and a landscape. It is keeping alive the dimension of the heritage that the genetics alone cannot preserve, the dimension that is constituted by consciousness and choice, and the active, continuing practice of belonging to a place. The linguist and cultural activist Ruairi Ulwi-Jin, writing about the significance of minority language traditions, has argued that the loss of a language is not just the loss of a communication system, but the loss of a way of being in the world, a way of organizing and relating to experience that cannot be fully translated into any other language. Every language encodes a specific perspective on reality, shaped by the history and environment and social organization of the community that developed it. When a language dies, that perspective dies with it, and what remains, even in the memories of those who once spoke the language, is impoverished by the loss of the medium through which the perspective was expressed. The Gaelic perspective on the Scottish Highland landscape, encoded in the vocabulary and the grammar and the oral literature of the language, is a perspective that has been shaped by thousands of years of intimate observation and engagement with that specific landscape. It contains knowledge that is not available in English, not because English is less capable of expressing knowledge generally, but because English was not developed by people living in the Highland landscape over thousands of years of close observation. The Gaelic place names of the Highland landscape encode observations about the ecology and the topography and the historical use of specific locations that are simply not present in the English names that have replaced them in many areas. That knowledge is in the language. When the language goes, the knowledge goes with it. This is the urgency that the genetic research, by revealing the depth of the connection between the Highland communities and their landscape, makes even more acute. These are not just communities with an interesting cultural tradition. They are communities with the deepest genetic heritage in Northern Europe, communities whose biological connection to the Atlantic landscape goes back to the beginning of human history in the British Isles. And the cultural tradition they carry is the human expression of that biological connection, the way in which the ancient relationship between people and place has been lived and understood and transmitted across the generations. To lose that cultural tradition in these specific communities, in the very places where the genetic heritage is most concentrated and most continuous, would be a loss of a particularly irreplaceable kind. Not because the genetic heritage would be lost with it. The DNA will continue to be copied from mother to child, regardless of what language those mothers and children speak. But because the human meaning of that genetic heritage, the context in which it makes sense as something more than a molecular record, would be diminished in a way that no amount of subsequent effort could fully restore. The standing stones at Callanish have stood for nearly 5,000 years. They have stood through the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and the Roman period, and the Pictish kingdoms, and the Norse settlement, and the medieval period, and the clearances, and the Industrial Revolution, and 2 world wars. They have stood through everything that Scottish history has thrown at them, because they are made of stone, and stone endures. The cultural tradition that surrounds them, the Gaelic stories and songs and practices that connect the living communities to the long history of the landscape those stones inhabit, is not made of stone. It is made of breath and voice and memory, and the continuous choices of living people to transmit what they received. It requires active care to survive. And the genetic heritage that connects the living communities to the builders of those stones, to the people who were in that landscape before the stones were raised, will survive as long as the communities survive. But it will mean more, will be legible in its full human significance, for as long as the cultural tradition that is its human expression also survives. The two together, the genetic thread and the cultural thread, constitute the full heritage of the Scottish Highlands and Islands. Both deserve recognition. Both deserve protection. Both represent something that is genuinely irreplaceable in the context of European and human history. The Atlantic is still there. The thread is still there. And the people who carry it, in their blood and in their voices and in their relationship to the extraordinary landscape that has shaped them, are still there. That is the story. And it is not finished yet. The specific genetics of the Scottish island populations deserves its own sustained examination, because the islands are where the oldest lineages are most concentrated and where the evidence for the ancient Atlantic heritage is clearest. The Outer Hebrides, the chain of islands that runs from Lewis and Harris in the north, through North Uist and Benbecula and South Uist to Barra and the smaller islands in the south, represent the Atlantic extremity of Scotland, and the place where the combination of geographic isolation, cultural continuity, and demographic stability has produced the most distinctive genetic profile in the entire British genetic landscape. The Outer Hebrides were inhabited in the Mesolithic period. We know this from the shell middens and the occasional stone tool assemblages that turn up in the coastal areas, most of them exposed by erosion of the sandy Machair deposits or the coastal peat. The specific lineages carried by those early inhabitants have not yet been recovered from ancient DNA because the acidic soils of the Outer Hebrides are not ideal for the preservation of ancient biological material. But we can infer from the modern population genetics, and from the analogy with sites elsewhere in Scotland where ancient DNA has been recovered, that the Mesolithic inhabitants of the Hebrides would have carried the same ancient Atlantic hunter-gatherer lineages that characterized the broader Hebridean genetic profile today. The Neolithic came to the Outer Hebrides along with the megalithic tradition that it brought across the Atlantic coast of Europe. Callanish on Lewis is the most famous monument of this tradition in the Hebrides, but it is not the only one. There are numerous other sites across Lewis and Harris, and the Uists and Barra, standing stones and stone settings and cairns and passage tombs that represent the full range of Neolithic monument building activity across a period of roughly 1,000 years. The people who built these monuments were the Neolithic farming communities of the Outer Hebrides, communities that had come to the islands from the Atlantic coast of Britain and Ireland, bringing their farming knowledge and their megalith building tradition and their genetic heritage with them. The genetic heritage they brought was already a mixture. It included the Near Eastern Neolithic ancestry that characterized the Atlantic Neolithic farmers across the entire arc from Portugal to Scotland. But it also included substantial contributions from the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations they had encountered on their way north, contributions that were larger in the Hebrides than in most of the rest of Britain because the indigenous presence in the northwest was strongest. The Neolithic Hebrideans were a specific mixture of ancient Atlantic hunter-gatherer ancestry and incoming Neolithic farmer ancestry, and that specific mixture has been part of the Hebridean genetic profile ever since. The Bronze Age brought R1b lineages to the Hebrides as it brought them everywhere in Britain and Western Europe. The Bell Beaker expansion reached the Outer Hebrides, and the R1b lineages that came with it have been diversifying on Hebridean soil ever since, producing the specifically Scottish sublineages that geneticists can now identify as belonging to the Highland and Island population. But the Bell Beaker transition in the Outer Hebrides, as in the rest of the Western Highlands, was less thoroughgoing than it was in southern Britain. The older lineages persisted at higher frequencies. The Neolithic and Mesolithic ancestry was diluted by the incoming Bronze Age ancestry, but not eliminated. The Norse settlement of the Outer Hebrides in the 9th and 10th centuries CE added the most recent major layer to the Hebridean genetic profile. The Norse settlers who came to the islands came primarily from Norway, and they brought with them Y chromosome lineages and mitochondrial lineages that were distinctively Scandinavian. In the Outer Hebrides, as in the Northern Islands, the Norse genetic contribution is visible in the modern population, though less dramatically than in Orkney and Shetland. A significant proportion of Hebridean men carry Y chromosomes of Norse origin, and Norse mitochondrial lineages are detectable in the female population as well. The Norse settlement was real and substantial, not just a political overlay on an unchanged indigenous population, but even in the Outer Hebrides, even in the islands most thoroughly affected by Norse settlement, the pre-Norse genetic substrate persists. The ancient Atlantic heritage is still detectable, still constituting a significant proportion of the Hebridean genetic profile, still connecting the islands to the deep history of the Atlantic coast. The Norse layer is real, but it is a layer on top of something older, and that something older is what makes the Hebridean genetic profile distinctive in the wider context of European genetics. There is a specific detail about the Norse settlement of the Outer Hebrides that is worth dwelling on, because it illustrates the complexity of the genetic history in a way that simple narratives of replacement and continuity cannot capture. The Norse who settled the Outer Hebrides did not come only from Norway. Some of them came from Ireland, and specifically from the Norse Gaelic communities that had established themselves in Ireland in the 9th and 10th centuries, communities that were themselves a mixture of Norse settlers and indigenous Irish populations. When these Irish Norse settlers came to the Outer Hebrides, they brought with them not just Norse Y chromosomes but also Gaelic language and Irish genetic contributions. And those Irish genetic contributions were themselves heavily weighted toward the ancient Atlantic hunter-gatherer and Neolithic farmer ancestry that characterizes the Irish population. So the Norse settlement of the Outer Hebrides, while it clearly added Scandinavian genetic material to the island population, also added Irish genetic material that reinforced the ancient Atlantic heritage already present in the islands. The incoming Norse Gaelic settlers from Ireland were, genetically, not entirely foreign to the existing Hebridean population. They shared a significant proportion of the ancient Atlantic ancestry that characterized both the existing Hebrideans and the Irish population. And their arrival, which reinforced the Gaelic language in the Outer Hebrides and helped establish the specifically Hebridean cultural tradition that persists in attenuated form today, also reinforced the genetic substrate that the Gaelic language and culture were expressing. This is the kind of complexity that makes the genetic history of Scotland so much richer than simple narratives of replacement and continuity can convey. Every major demographic event, the Neolithic arrival, the Bronze Age Bell Beaker expansion, the Norse settlement, the Gaelic consolidation of Alba, was not a simple story of one population replacing another. It was a story of mixing, of the incoming and the existing, interacting and intermixing, and producing new combinations that retained elements of both. And in the Scottish Highlands and Islands, the mixing always left more of the ancient substrate intact than it did in the more accessible and more frequently disrupted parts of Britain. The result is a genetic landscape of extraordinary subtlety and depth, not a simple picture of an ancient isolated population that never changed, not a simple picture of a population that was repeatedly swept clean by incoming waves, but a layered, complex, historically specific combination of ancient and newer elements that reflects the specific history of a specific place in the most detailed biological terms available. When you look at a mitochondrial haplogroup distribution map of Scotland today, what you see is not a uniform surface but a mosaic. The H1 and H3 lineages of the ancient Atlantic Neolithic farmers are distributed across the country, but at higher frequencies in the northwest. The U5 lineages of the ancient hunter-gatherers are distributed across the country, but with their highest concentrations in the Highlands and Islands. The Norse mitochondrial lineages cluster in the northern and western islands. The more recent Gaelic and lowland Scottish contributions are distributed according to the patterns of historical population movement that are partly reconstructed from the historical record and partly revealed for the first time by the MNATP, genetics itself. Each of these distributions is a record of a specific historical process. The U5 distributions record the Mesolithic occupation of Scotland and the partial survival of that occupation through the subsequent demographic transitions. The H1 and H3 distributions record the Neolithic farming expansion and its mixing with the indigenous population. The Norse lineage distributions record the Viking Age settlement of the islands. And the overall pattern, with its concentration of ancient lineages in the northwest and its more recent additions distributed according to the patterns of historical contact and exchange, is a genetic map of Scottish history in its entirety. This is what the genetics gives us that no other source can provide. Not just the what of who was in Scotland and when, but the how and the why, the connections between the different periods of demographic history, the ways in which each period built on and modified what came before, the threads of continuity that run through all the change and connect the present to the deepest past. The genetics is a historical document of extraordinary richness and depth. It is still being read. Its full content is still being recovered. And what has been recovered so far is remarkable enough to transform our understanding of who the Scottish people are and where they came from. The people of the Highlands and Islands are the inheritors of a history that the genetics is only now making fully visible. They have always known, in the way that communities know things without always being able to articulate them, that their connection to their landscape was deep and old and important. The cultural tradition expressed this knowledge in the songs and stories and practices of the Gaelic heritage. The place names encoded it in the landscape itself. The genealogies preserved it in the chains of name descent that connected the living to their ancestors. And now the genetics is providing a new dimension of that knowledge, a molecular record that extends the chain of connection back beyond the named ancestors to the unnamed populations of the deep prehistoric past. The bloodline found nowhere else in Europe is the product of all of this. It is the genetic expression of a history that is longer and deeper and more remarkable than most accounts of Scottish history convey. And it is still there, still flowing in the blood of the people of the Highlands and Islands, still connecting them to the beginning of human history on the Atlantic coast of Britain. The Atlantic will keep coming in, the thread will keep running back, and the story will keep being worth telling as long as there are people willing to follow it to its beginning, which is a very long way back indeed. There is a question that we have been circling around throughout this entire account, but have not yet addressed directly. It is a question that the genetics raises, but cannot answer on its own. It is a question about what ancient genetic heritage means for how we should live now, for what obligations we have to the places and communities and traditions that the genetics reveals as carrying extraordinary historical depth. The science tells us what is. It tells us that the Scottish Highlands and Islands carry the oldest continuous genetic heritage in Northern Europe. It tells us that the communities in those places are the living bearers of a biological thread that goes back to the beginning of human history in the British Isles. It tells us that the specific combination of ancient lineages preserved in those communities is genuinely unique in the European genetic landscape. These are facts. They are supported by evidence. They are not going to change no matter what we think about their implications. But what we do with those facts, what obligations they create, and what choices they inform, that is not a scientific question. That is a human question, a political and ethical and cultural question that the communities most directly affected are the appropriate people to engage with. The genetics can tell the descendants of the Highland diaspora something about their biological connection to the landscape their ancestors came from. It cannot tell them whether to seek to return, whether to invest in the Gaelic cultural revival, whether to prioritize the preservation of the Highland communities in their political choices. Those are choices that belong to the people, not to the data. What the genetics can do, and what it is increasingly doing as the research becomes better known and more widely communicated, is change the terms of the conversation. When politicians and planners and economists discuss the future of the Highlands and Islands, they typically do so in terms of economic development, of infrastructure investment, of population sustainability, of the viability of small rural communities in a modern economy. These are real and important considerations, but they tend to treat the Highland communities as one type of rural community among many, not as communities with a specifically extraordinary historical significance that sets them apart from other rural communities in Europe. The genetics changes that. It reveals the Highland and Island communities as the bearers of a genetic heritage that no other European communities carry. It provides a specific and measurable dimension of their historical significance that goes beyond cultural attachment or political sentiment. It makes the case that the preservation of these communities is not just a matter of respecting cultural diversity or supporting local identity, but a matter of preserving something that is, in the most literal biological sense, irreplaceable. If these communities are dispersed beyond recovery, the specific genetic heritage they carry will be dispersed with them, and what remains will be something qualitatively different from what was lost. This is a strong argument. It should be part of the conversation about the future of the Highlands and Islands, not as the only argument, not as a trump card that settles all other considerations, but as a dimension of the community's significance that has not previously been fully visible and that the genetics is now making available. And alongside the genetic argument, there is the cultural argument, the linguistic argument, the ecological argument. The Gaelic language encodes ecological knowledge developed over thousands of years of human engagement with the Highland landscape. That knowledge has practical value as well as cultural value for understanding and managing that landscape in a time of environmental change. The seasonal practices and the traditional ecological knowledge of the Highland communities are resources, human and intellectual resources, that took millennia to develop and that will be permanently lost if the communities that carry them are dispersed. The genetics tells us that those communities are the biological descendants of the people who developed that knowledge. Not the only descendants, since the diaspora carries the genetics too, but the communities in which that knowledge is still being practiced, still being transmitted, still being maintained as a living tradition rather than an archived memory. The combination of genetic continuity and cultural continuity in those specific communities is the combination that makes them uniquely valuable, uniquely irreplaceable, uniquely worth supporting and sustaining. The Atlantic keeps coming in, the thread keeps running back, and the people who carry it, the bearers of the oldest continuous genetic heritage in Northern Europe, the keepers of a cultural tradition developed over thousands of years of intimate engagement with an extraordinary landscape, are still there, still watching the Atlantic, still speaking, where they can still speak it, the language that their ancestors have spoken in that landscape for more than 1,000 years, still carrying, in their blood, the record of all the generations that came before. That is the bloodline found nowhere else in Europe. Ancient, continuous, remarkable, and still alive, still flowing, still connecting the present to the deepest past, still worth following, as we have followed it tonight, all the way back to the beginning, where the ice was, where the people came, where they stayed, and where, if we pay attention to what the genetics is telling us, some of their descendants are still staying now, in the hard and beautiful places at the edge of the world, on the Atlantic coast of Scotland, where the thread began and where, if we are lucky, it will continue for a very long time still. One last thought, before this account comes to its close. The geneticists who do this work, who spend their careers extracting DNA from ancient bones and comparing it against modern genomes, and building the detailed picture of European demographic history that is now transforming how we understand ourselves and our past, they did not set out to find something remarkable about Scotland. They set out to understand how human populations moved and changed across the continent over thousands of years. Scotland was one region among many, one set of data points among thousands, one piece of a puzzle that spans the entire habitable world. And yet, repeatedly, the Scottish data has produced findings that stand out, that concentrate the mind, that refuse to fit neatly into the standard models and demand a more specific and more historically grounded explanation. The frequencies of ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Highlands and Islands, the specific diversity pattern of the R1b sublineages on Scottish soil, the persistence of the Neolithic ancestry through the Bronze Age transition, the extraordinary regional specificity of the genetic clusters within Scotland, still reflecting the political geography of more than 1,000 years ago. Each of these findings, when placed in the broader context of European genetic history, points in the same direction, toward Scotland, and within Scotland, toward the Highlands and Islands, as a place of genuinely unusual historical depth and genetic continuity. This is not what the researchers were looking for. It is what the data kept insisting on. And when data insists on something that the researcher was not looking for, that is the most reliable kind of finding. Not the result of confirmation bias or motivated reasoning, but the result of evidence that will not be quiet about what it shows. The evidence is not quiet about what it shows in Scotland. It shows a place where the ancient world has not entirely gone, where the genetic heritage of the Atlantic coast of post-glacial Europe has survived, in concentrated form, into the present, where the thread is long and the record is real, and the connection between the living and the deep dead is not metaphor but molecular fact. That is what the bloodline found nowhere else in Europe means. Not superiority, not special destiny.